Somewhere to his right, a child was wheezing laboriously, that very sound that occurs only with pneumonia. And Daniel Hayworth sat in the mud of a strange village, in a strange body, and already understood everything. These children weren't dying from illness, they were dying from stupidity. And he was the only person among the 130 residents who knew why. He woke up face down in the mud, real mud, a thick, stinking sludge in which something warm was floating. He inhaled, drawing that filth into his nostrils. He coughed. He rolled over. Rain lashed his face with heavy drops. He opened his eyes and stared at a stick. The stick poked him in the shoulder. Behind the stick stood a girl of about 12, looking at him as if he were a dead rat that was still twitching. Without fear, with disgusted curiosity. He sat up. The world swayed and settled back into place. And then he saw the village and regretted sitting down. Huts with wattle and daub walls, the clay plaster flaking off in chunks, exposing the rotten framework. The roofs sagged under the weight of water. A brown stream flowed down the street, carrying sewage and other debris. The north wall of the nearest house was blackened with mold from the foundation to the roof, and a fire was burning inside that house. People lived there. Dan stood up. His knees were shaking. His body felt like someone else's, younger and lighter than he remembered. But his brain was doing what it always did. It was calculating. It was 6 meters from the nearest shack to the cesspit. No lid, no lining. The groundwater in this low-lying area was high. That meant anything that fell into the pit would end up in the well within a week. He turned his head. The well stood right in the middle of the mess. It was less than 10 steps between him and the pit. These people were drinking water into which their sewage flowed every day, and they were giving it to their children to drink. The girl said something. The words were foreign, but the meaning shone through the sound like a drawing through frosted glass. She was asking if he was alive or dead, and whether they should call the village headman to drag him to the pit. Dan looked at the well. He looked at the stream of sewage flowing between the houses where the children slept. And he said aloud in English, which no one here understood, "Let's start with the drainage." He took the stick from the girl. He crouched down in the mud and began to draw. A line from the well up the slope. A circle. Another line away from the houses. The girl crouched down beside him. She didn't understand what he was drawing, but it was the first interesting thing to happen in Clay Ford in half a year. A man came out of the hut, broad-shouldered, weather-beaten, distrustful. It was Garrick, the village elder. For 20 years he had kept this village from falling apart with his bare hands and sheer stubbornness. He glanced at the lines in the mud and saw nothing in them. Just a wet stranger in strange clothes who was defacing the ground in front of his house. Garrick asked who he was. His speech became clearer and clearer, as if someone were turning up the volume on a radio. Dan understood the question. He replied that he had come. He didn't explain where from. Garrick asked what he could do, the most important question in a world where every mouth must be fed. Dan pointed with his stick at the black wall, at the well, at the sewage stream, and he spoke slowly. "I can make sure the children don't get sick." Garrick didn't believe him, but he didn't send him away either. There were 4 months left until winter, and every pair of hands counted. A stranger could stay if he worked. They gave him a shed with 3 walls and a leaky roof. Dan lay down on straw that smelled of mold and mice. He couldn't sleep. He lay there and thought. Move the well higher up the slope, 50 paces from the pits. Line it with stone. There's no stone. No, there is. He'd seen a ridge of black rocks above the village. Basalt, heavy, strong, eternal. A drainage ditch ran from the houses down the slope. Anyone could dig a ditch. Ventilation, a crack under the roof ridge, just a hole in the right place. People were suffocating in their own homes and didn't understand why, because no one had explained to them that a house needs to breathe. In the morning, he went to the hut with the black wall. Inside, the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The stove was burning with an open flame. The smoke wasn't going up the chimney, but into the room. Two children lay on a straw mat against the far wall. One was asleep. The other was wheezing with his eyes open, and every breath came so hard that his thin body shuddered. A woman sat beside him. She was thin, with cracked hands and a face etched with nothing but exhaustion. It was Myra, a widow. The younger one's name was Tom. He was 4, and he'd been wheezing every night since last fall. Every night, Myra thought this would be his last. Dan didn't ask for permission. He walked in, crouched down, and began drawing on the dirt floor with a charred stick. A pit by the north wall, an elbow deep and filled with gravel. The water would drain into it instead of pooling at the foundation and feeding the mold. A clay pipe under the threshold would carry the water outside along a slope, and a crack under the ridge beam on the far side from the door. Air would flow from the door to the crack and carry out the smoke, the moisture, and that invisible poison that was killing Tom. He didn't know the word ventilation. He pointed at the walls, at Tom, and said, "The house is sick. The house isn't breathing. The child is sick because the house is sick." Myra wasn't looking at the blueprint. She was looking at him. She was trying to figure out what he stood to gain from this, what he wanted in return. Dan didn't want anything. He wanted only one thing, for the boy to stop wheezing. He couldn't stand to hear that sound. Around noon, Garrick stopped by with 3 guys. They looked at the blueprint as if it were the ravings of a madman. Garrick said it was just a shack. Dan replied calmly, "This is the home of Myra and her sons. By tomorrow evening, the youngest will stop wheezing at night." Garrick snorted, but he didn't stop him. Dan dug alone until dark. Blisters formed after an hour. After 2 hours, they burst. He kept going. He shoveled gravel by the handful. He cobbled together a crooked, ugly chimney, but with a slope. He cut a slit under the ridge with a knife that Myra had lent him. She brought him water, then some bread. He ate without stopping. By evening, the house looked the same from the outside, but inside, the smoke was drawn toward the slit and escaped outside, instead of hanging in a layer beneath the ceiling. The ground by the north wall had become drier. Not dry, drier. For a 4-year-old boy with diseased lungs, that was the difference between life and death. That night, Dan lay in the shed and couldn't fall asleep. His hands burned and his back ached. He thought about the chimney. The slope was right, the crack was in the right place, simple physics. Warm air rises, cold air is drawn in from below through the door. Draft. The smoke goes away, the moisture goes away, the mold loses its food source. The boy was breathing easier. The next evening, Myra found him by the stream, where he was washing his hands. She said 3 words. Tom was sleeping peacefully. He wasn't wheezing. For the first time in 4 months. She didn't cry. She stood there, unable to comprehend how it worked. He dug a hole and cut a hole in the roof, and her son was breathing. Why hadn't her husband, who'd lived in this house for 6 years, thought of a hole in the roof? Garrett came over too. He was silent. He looked at Dan with the same gaze clients used to give him when they suddenly realized that this quiet man with glasses could see what they couldn't. Only here, there was no project on the screen. Here was a boy who had stopped wheezing, and that was more convincing than any presentation. On the 3rd day, an old man from the far end led his 5-year-old granddaughter by the hand. The girl coughed incessantly, her eyes red and teary. The old man didn't ask for anything. He just brought her over and looked. The same black wall, the same stagnant air, the same slow death packed into 4 walls and a thatched roof. Dan needed a pair of hands. He found a girl with a stick standing on the threshold of the village elder's house. Her name was Lissa. He asked if she wanted to help. She asked what she'd get in return. He said he'd teach her to count. She didn't want to learn to count, but watching him dig around in the mud was fun, so she went along. By the end of the week, Dan had fixed 3 huts. 3 holes, 3 pipes, 3 vents. In 2 of the 3, the children stopped coughing at night. The third one was trickier. There, the problem wasn't the air, but the water, the well. He kept coming back to it again and again. He tried to explain it to Haddock. Haddock didn't understand. Water is water, murky and smelly. What else could it be? Dan said the water was killing their children. Haddock looked at him as if he were crazy. Water can't kill. Water is life. It was useless to explain. He had to show them. Dan took Lissa and 2 guys and led them up the slope. Above the village, above the vegetable gardens, above the pits, he found a spot where the slope had a natural incline. This was where they needed to dig a new well. The guys asked why, since there was already a well. Dan drew a picture on the ground with a stick. Here's the village. Here's the pit with the sewage. Here's the well between them. Water flows from top to bottom through the sewage into the well. The guy looked at the drawing. Then he turned pale. He turned toward the village. He looked at Dan, and he said one word that Dan would remember forever. Show me. They dug for 4 days. Dan marked out a circle with a rope tied to a stake in the center. He showed them how to keep the walls straight using a stone on a string, the simplest plumb line. The guys looked at the stone on the string as if it were magic. Then one of them laughed and started digging straighter. On the 4th day, they reached water. It was crystal clear. Dan scooped up a handful and held it out. The guys scooped some up too. One of them ran off to the village. An hour later, half of Glignani Brod was gathered around the new well. They stared at the crystal clear water, unable to believe their eyes. Garrick was the last to arrive. He scooped some up, sniffed it, tasted it, and stood there for a moment. He looked at Dan and said nothing. But that evening, for the first time, they made room for Dan by the communal campfire. And Myra brought him a bowl of hot stew, thick, with meat. Not the slop they fed to outsiders, but real food, prepared for their own people. Dan ate and watched the village in the light of the campfire. 23 huts, 130 people. A third of them are children. Half the children are sick at any given time. They have no bricks, no lime, no tools, no knowledge. They have clay, straw, and their own hands. And now they have him, an architect without a workshop, an engineer without tools, a man who knows what the right kind of world looks like and sits in the middle of the wrong one, with a bowl of gruel in his hands. A ridge of black rocks rose above the village in the darkness. The dragon's back. Lissa noticed where he was looking and said that you couldn't go up there. There's a curse there. Old stones that must not be touched. Whoever goes up there won't come back. Dan asked who had gone up there last. Lissa thought for a moment and said, no one. Not in her memory, nor in her grandmother's memory, nor in her great-grandmother's memory. Dan looked at the black silhouette of the rocks against the backdrop of the stars. Basalt. Kilometers of basalt. The strongest stone in nature. And up there were ruins. Ruins meant cut stone. Cut stone meant that someone, long ago, knew how to build. And if the stones were still standing after 300 years, it meant they'd been built well. He needed that stone. He needed those ruins. But that would come later. First, the well. First, the pipes. First, one house after another, one at a time. The morning after the first clean well began with a scream. Dan woke up to the sound of someone yelling at the edge of the village. Not from pain, from rage. He scrambled out of the shed and ran toward the sound. Standing by the old well was the village blacksmith, a huge man with arms like two ham hocks and a face crimson with fury. Kneeling before him was one of the two young men who'd helped with the digging. The blacksmith was holding him by the collar of his shirt and shaking him like a sack. People were gathering around. Dan squeezed his way closer and listened. The blacksmith was yelling that this punk had skipped work at the smithy for 2 days to dig a stupid hole for a stranger, that the stranger had arrived yesterday and would be gone tomorrow, but the blacksmith shop would remain, that the young people had completely lost their minds, that his grandfather had dug a well here and his father had drawn water here, and the water had always been like this. There was no need to make things up. The young man's name was Brack. He was 19, broad-shouldered with dark eyes and a quiet voice that didn't match his size. He'd been the blacksmith's apprentice for 6 years, and in those 6 years, he hadn't heard a single kind word from him. Now he was kneeling in the mud, saying nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the blacksmith was his senior, and it wasn't customary to contradict your elders in Clayford. Dan approached. The blacksmith saw him and pointed a finger like a spear. "You, stranger, this is your fault." Dan stopped 3 paces away. He could have explained about the groundwater. He could have explained about the diseases. He could have told him why clean water was more important than 2 days in the forge, but he saw the blacksmith's face. It wasn't the face of a man who wanted to listen. It was the face of a man who was afraid. Afraid because the stranger had done in a week what no one had done in 20 years. And if the stranger was right, then those 20 years had been wrong. And the blacksmith had lived through those 20 years, and his father had lived through them, and his grandfather. Dan said only one thing. He said that Brack was a good digger, that he had a keen eye and strong hands, and that in 3 days he would need someone who knew how to work with metal, because he was going to make a tool the village had never seen before. The blacksmith fell silent, not because he believed it, but because Dan had said the word tool. And a tool is blacksmithing, and blacksmithing is his domain. He let Brack go. He grumbled something about outsiders sticking their noses where they didn't belong, and he left. Brack stood up. He looked at Dan. He nodded, and he went to the smithy. But that evening, he came back to Dan, and he brought 2 more people with him. The second guy's name was Oren, tall and skinny, with eyes that were always half closed, as if he were constantly looking at something far away. The third was a girl, Nell, 17 years old, the potter's daughter. Her hands were buried in clay up to her elbows, and her head was full of questions that no one wanted to hear. She hadn't come because she'd been told to, but because she'd seen Dan shaping clay pipes and wanted to understand why he worked the clay differently than her father did. Dan looked at the 3 of them and realized he had a crew. A small one, untrained, but a crew nonetheless. People who had come of their own accord. That was more important than the well. A well can be dug in 4 days. Trust cannot be dug up. It either comes on its own or it doesn't come at all. He began to teach them, not architecture, simple things, how to build a right angle using a rope and 3 stakes, the 3-4-5 rule, measure out 3 knots along the rope in one direction, 4 in the other. If the distance between the ends is exactly 5 knots, then the angle is a right angle. Brack tried it and got it right on the first try. He stood there looking at that angle as if it were a miracle. Then he looked at the nearest hut, whose walls had been built by eye and leaned outward like a drunkard. Then back at the rope. And Dan saw something change in his eyes. The boy saw the difference between by eye and correctly, and that difference was now impossible to overlook. Nell picked it up even faster. She already knew clay. She knew which kinds were rich, which were lean, which were suitable for pottery and which cracked. Dan explained to her that for building, you needed clay mixed with sand and fine straw. That pure clay cracks when it dries, but with additives, it becomes strong. Nell nodded, and her eyes burned with the same fire that Dan had seen in his best students during practical training, the fire of understanding. On the 10th day, Isla Ven arrived in the village. She didn't just show up out of the blue. She lived on the outskirts in a small hut that was only slightly better than the others, because Isla had thought to build it a little higher up the hillside. She was an herbalist. She was the apprentice of an old herbalist who had died the previous spring, leaving Isla a sack of dried roots and not a single clear explanation of why they were needed. Isla figured it out on her own, through trial and error. Sometimes there were more trials than there should have been, but she didn't stop. She was 19 years old, and she asked too many questions for a 19-year-old girl in a village where questions were considered a luxury. She didn't come to Dan with a question about houses. She came with a question about her drying shed, a small outbuilding attached to her cabin where she hung herbs to dry. The herbs were getting moldy, every fall, every winter. She was losing half her supply and didn't understand why. An old herbalist had said that spirits were ruining the harvest as punishment for sins. Isla didn't believe in spirits, but she had no other explanation. Dan went with her. He looked at the drying shed. It was an enclosed space, not a single opening except for the door. The walls were solid, the roof was tight, a perfect trap for moisture. Herbs release moisture as they dry. The moisture had nowhere to go. It settled on the walls, on the herbs themselves. Mold. It was simple. He told her the same thing he'd told Myra. A house needs to breathe. A drying room needs to breathe even more. It needs 2 openings. One at the bottom on the windward side, one at the top on the leeward side. Air will flow through, moisture will escape with the flow, the herbs will dry out. Ayla listened, not the way Garrick listened, not with skepticism, not with distrust. She listened the way someone listens who has finally received the answer to a question that had tormented them for years. Then she asked why. Why does the air flow from the lower opening to the upper one? Dan explained. Warm air rises. It's lighter than cold air. As it rises, it exits through the top opening. New air is drawn in from below to take its place. A simple cycle. Ayla was silent for a minute. Then she said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard in her life. Dan didn't immediately realize she was talking about the air, not him. She drilled the holes that very same day, all by herself. She didn't ask for help. A week later, she brought Dan a bundle of dried herbs, dry, not a single speck of mold. She placed it in front of him and said she wanted to know everything. Everything he knew about how things worked, how water flows, how air moves, how one stone holds another. Everything. Dan looked at her dirt-stained fingers, at the 4 pouches with strings hanging from her belt, at the eyes that burned with such a hunger for knowledge that it made him almost uneasy. And he said he would teach her, but in return, she would teach him. Which herbs help with what? Where certain clays are found? Which stones are stronger? She knew this land. He knew the laws by which this land was governed. Together, they knew enough. By the end of the 2nd week, Dan had 5 students: Brack, Oren, Nell, Isla, and Lissa. Lissa wasn't technically a student. She was a shadow. She followed Dan everywhere. She held his tools, counted bricks, handed him ropes, and memorized everything. Everything. Every word, every movement, every curse he muttered when something went wrong. She had gotten herself a piece of birch bark and some symbols with which she marked his words. Dan caught her doing this on the 3rd day and asked what she was doing. Lissa showed him. One symbol meant a curse when a stone fell, another when a wall was crooked, a third when Garrick wouldn't let people work. The third symbol had a note next to it. "He says this one the most," she wrote. Dan moved on to the next step, the stoves. All the stoves in the village were open hearths. The fire burned on the floor in the middle of the hut or against a wall. Smoke filled the space and escaped through the door. Or didn't. People lived in that smoke. They slept in it. They breathed it in. Their lungs were black by the time they turned 30. Dan knew how to build the simplest chimney, a clay pipe running from the hearth to the roof, vertical, with a flared bottom to create draft. It was the simplest design known in his world since Roman times. Here, no one had heard of it. He built the first chimney in Myra's house. Nell helped mold the pipe. 3 sections made of clay mixed with straw. Each section dried for a day. Then they put them together, set it up, caulked the joints, lit a fire. The smoke rose up, into the pipe, through the roof, out into the open. For the first time in that house, it was possible to stand at full height and see the opposite wall. Myra stood in the middle of the room, turning her head from side to side. Tom and his older brother Cale sat by the hearth, watching the fire, which no longer stung their eyes. Kyle said it was witchcraft. Tom said the smoke was going up into the sky to the birds. Myra said nothing. She walked over to Dan and looked at him with a gaze that spoke volumes. He built the second chimney in the house of the old man who used to bring his granddaughter over. The third was in Brack's house. Garrick asked for a fourth one to be built, for himself. He came in the evening when no one was watching. He sat down next to Dan by the shed and said that his wife had been coughing every night for 3 years now, that she had trouble breathing, that he'd thought it was just old age. She was 42. Dan went and built a chimney for Garrick, and when the village headman's wife woke up the next morning for the first time in 3 years without coughing, Garrick stepped out of the house and announced that the stranger was staying. Not just staying, the stranger would be given people to work for him. 2 people a day. The village couldn't afford more. 2 people a day and whatever materials he asked for. 2 people a day. Dan did the math. That meant each house would take a week to renovate. 23 houses, 23 weeks, almost half a year just to give every house a chimney and drainage. Too long. He needed more people. Or a different approach. He chose a different approach. He wouldn't renovate each house one by one. He would train 5 crews, and each crew would perform a single task. One crew would dig drainage pits, another would mold pipes, a third would cut ventilation slots. An assembly line, division of labor, a concept that had emerged in his world in the 18th century, but hadn't even been dreamed of here yet. He gathered his 5 team members that evening. He explained the plan. Each of you will train 2 more people, just one task. Brack teaches them to dig pits of the correct shape and depth. Nell teaches them to mold pipes of the correct diameter. Oren teaches them to cut vents in the right places. Isla monitors the quality of the clay. Lissa keeps track of the count and runs errands. They listened. Then Brack asked what Dan himself would be doing. Dan said he would go from house to house and show exactly where to dig and where to place the pipe. Because every house is built differently. Every house is sick in its own way, and each one needs to be treated differently. The system started working. Not right away. The first 2 days were chaos. People got the measurements wrong. They made the pipes too thin, and they cracked. They dug the holes too shallow, and the water wouldn't drain. Dan rushed from house to house fixing things. He cursed. Lissa wrote down new symbols. By the 3rd day, things were getting better. By the 5th day, it was even better. By the end of the 3rd week, there wasn't a single house left in the village without a chimney. For the first time in its entire history, the air in Glenyani Broad was breathable. But Dan was already thinking about what came next. Chimneys and drainage were just a bandage on the wound. The The wound was still open. The houses were still made of rotten wattle and crumbling clay. The walls were still getting soaked through by mid-fall. The roofs still collapse under the weight of heavy snow. These houses have 3 years left to live, maybe 5 if the weather cooperates. He needed bricks, real fired bricks, a material that would last 100 years and wouldn't require repairs every spring. He knew how to make them. He knew in theory: clay, sand, water, molding, drying, firing. Firing temperature from 900 to 1,100 degrees. For that, he needs a kiln, not a home hearth. A special kiln. The kiln needs firewood. Lots of firewood. Firewood requires people's time and the village head's permission to cut down trees. Garrick would say no. Dan knew that. Firewood in the village was worth its weight in gold. Every log went toward heating. Wasting firewood on some kind of firing when winter was just around the corner was madness from the perspective of a man who had been saving every scrap of wood for 20 years. Dan needed an argument, not words, proof. He needed a single brick. One single brick that he would place in front of Garrick and say, "Here, touch it. Try to break it. Hit it against a rock. Pour water on it. It won't get soggy. It won't fall apart. It won't rot. You can build walls with this that will last longer than you, me, and your grandchildren combined." He found clay by a stream below the village. Good, dense clay with a low organic content. He mixed it with sand and chopped straw in the proportions he remembered from his course on historical building materials. 3 parts clay, 1 part sand, and a handful of finely chopped straw for reinforcement. Water until it reached the consistency of thick dough. He molded a single brick the size of 2 palms. He left it to dry in the sun. 2 days later, the brick had hardened. But it wasn't a brick yet. It was a green brick, dried clay that would crumble at the first heavy rain. To make a real brick, you need fire. He dug a pit, not very deep. He lined the walls with stones. At the bottom, he laid dry branches and logs that he'd been secretly gathering for 3 days. He placed his green brick on top of the stones and set it on fire. The fire burned all night. Dan sat nearby and stoked the fire with branches. Ayla came at midnight. She sat down next to him. She asked what he was doing. He explained. She was silent. Then she asked how he knew all this. Dan thought for a long time. Then he said it was from another world. Ayla nodded as if that were a perfectly normal answer. She asked if it rained there too. Dan said yes. Ayla said, "So it's not that different after all." And she stayed sitting there until morning. Garrick held the brick with both hands. He turned it over and over. He tapped it with his fingernail. He brought it up to his nose and sniffed it. Then he placed it on the threshold of his house and stepped on it. The brick didn't crack. Garrick stepped on it with his other foot. He stood on it with all his weight. The brick held. The village elder stepped down from the threshold and looked at Dan for a long time. Then he asked how many of them were needed. Dan said that about 800 were needed for one house. Garrick asked how much firewood was needed for firing. Dan told the truth. A lot. A whole lot. Garrick was silent. Then he said he wouldn't provide firewood for firing. Winter was coming. Every log counted. A stranger could make his red bricks out of whatever he wanted, but the community's firewood was off limits. Dan had expected this. He didn't argue. He asked one thing. Could he gather deadwood in the forest? Dry branches, fallen trunks, whatever was lying on the ground and rotting. Garrick shrugged. He didn't forbid gathering deadwood. Nobody needed deadwood. It was too damp and didn't burn well. Dan nodded and left. He needed a kiln, not a pit with a fire that had yielded him a single rough brick. A real firing kiln, with a sealed chamber so the heat wouldn't escape into the air but would accumulate, with a grate so the hot air would rise evenly, with a vent for draft. A kiln like that could fire 100 bricks in a single load under the right conditions. And it could run on deadwood if the deadwood was dried out beforehand. He chose a spot below the village, by a stream, far from the houses. The wind blew from the west here, carrying the smoke away from the dwellings. He marked out a rectangle on the ground, 2 steps by 3. The walls were made of clay reinforced with stone. Inside, there were 2 zones, the lower one for the fire, the upper one was for the bricks. Between them was a partition made of flat stones with slits, through which the heat could pass. The semicircular vault was made of the same clay. There was an opening at the front for loading firewood. The chimney was at the back. It took 5 days to build. Brack and Oren helped. Nell shaped the interior walls. She turned out to be a better clay artisan than her own father. Her hands knew the material as well as a musician knows an instrument. Dan showed her the shape, and she replicated it on the first try. Smooth, even, with walls of just the right thickness. He watched her work and thought that in his world, she would be a potter of national competition caliber. Here, she was a potter's daughter who wasn't allowed to work at the wheel because it was men's work. While they were building the kiln, Dan sent Isla and Lissa out to gather firewood. Every day they went into the forest for 3 hours and returned with bundles of dry branches. Lissa hauled back so much that Dan couldn't figure out how she managed to carry it all. She was small and skinny, but stubborn as a mule. They laid the firewood out on stones in the sun to dry it further. In 5 days, they'd gathered enough for the first firing. The kiln turned out to be rather unattractive. It was bumpy on the outside, with an uneven arch and a crooked chimney, but inside it was perfectly shaped. The heat would rise through the gaps in the partition. The bricks on the top tier would be fired evenly. The smoke would escape through the chimney. The temperature would rise high enough if they kept the fire going continuously. The first load. 80 mud bricks molded over the previous week. They were stacked on the top tier with gaps to allow hot air to circulate. The bottom tier was packed with firewood. Dan lit the fire, and then he waited. Firing takes between 12 and 20 hours, depending on the temperature. He kept watch by the kiln all night, adding branches every half hour. Brack relieved him at dawn. Then Oren. By noon the next day, Dan said that was enough. Let it cool down. The kiln cooled for a full day. Dan didn't sleep that night either. He paced around, checking the temperature of the walls with his hand. Isla brought him some herbal tea that cleared his head and pushed his fatigue back a little. He asked what was in it. She smiled and said it was her secret. On the 3rd morning, he opened the kiln and froze. Of the 80 bricks, 62 had survived. 18 had cracked. 7 had crumbled. But 62 were intact. Red. Resonant. Dan picked one up and tapped it with his fingernail. The brick rang out. A clear, high-pitched sound. The sound of a proper firing. He handed the brick to Nell. She took it with both hands and, for some reason, pressed it against her cheek. Warm, she said. Still warm. Garrick came to take a look. Half the village followed him. The bricks lay in a row on the ground. 62 red bricks. People came up and touched them. They tapped on them. One man picked up a brick and threw it at a rock with all his might. The brick split in half, but each half remained solid. The man picked up a half and looked at Dan with an expression that was half respect, half fear. Garrick asked what it was made of. Dan said clay, the same clay their houses were plastered with. Just fired. Just passed through the fire. Garrick was silent. Then he said it looked like the material the old stones up above were made of, on the dragon's back. Dan turned to him. He asked why he thought so. Garrick said his grandfather had told him. that the stones up there were red too, that they also rang out if you tapped them. Dan looked up at the black silhouette of the cliffs. Red stones that ring out. Noir brick. The empire that collapsed 300 years ago also knew the art of firing clay and built things from it that still stand to this day. That night, Dan didn't sleep. Not because he was tired, because of his thoughts. He lay in his shed and stared at the ceiling. The bricks were being fired. The kiln was running. But 62 bricks are nothing. One house requires 800. 23 houses require 18,000. One kiln produces 60 bricks in 3 days. He'd need 300 loads. 300 loads at 3 days each equals 900 days. 2.5 years. Unacceptable. He needed more kilns. Or a bigger kiln. Or a different approach. A different approach. He sat down. What if, instead of rebuilding the old houses, he built new ones? Not in the lowlands, not in this rotten swamp. Higher up, on a slope, where the ground is firm and the water flows downhill instead of pooling at his feet. He could plan the settlement anew, from scratch, with the houses laid out properly, with the right distances between them, with streets wide enough for a cart to pass, with a well in the right place, with a cesspit in another right place, with the wind carrying the smoke away instead of blowing it back into the houses. But that's for later. That's a plan for months from now. Right now, he needs to solve one specific problem: winter. By his estimates, there are 2.5 months left until the first frost. If winter here is as he suspects, cold, long, with deep snow. These houses won't hold up. Drainage and chimneys will help, but the walls, the wattle and daub walls, will freeze right through. People will burn firewood day and night, and there won't be enough. He needs insulation. Simple, quick insulation that can be done in the time remaining. Double walls, that's it. Not to rebuild the houses, but to add another layer. A second layer of wattle on the outside, with a gap the width of a palm. Fill the gap with dry straw or moss or anything that traps air. An air gap, the simplest form of insulation. The same materials they already have. The same hands that are already trained. Just a different design. He drew up a diagram for the crew that morning. Brack understood right away. Oren got it after 5 minutes. Nell suggested using a clay plaster between the layers instead of just air. Dan thought about it and said she was right. Clay mixed with straw between 2 layers of wattle is adobe, one of the oldest building materials in history. Strong, warm, and cheap. Nell didn't know the word adobe, but she knew clay, and she knew that clay mixed with straw made for something right. She just didn't know what to call it. Work was in full swing. The crews who had learned to build chimneys were now learning to build the second walls. Dan went from house to house, marking out the layout. Here's the outer layer, here's the gap, here's the fill. Garrick had assigned not 2, but 4 people per day. Not because he believed in the plan, but because his wife was sleeping warm and wasn't coughing. That was a stronger argument than any words. Toward the end of the 4th week, a stranger arrived in the village. Not from the forest. He came along the road from the south, riding a horse. He wore a leather jacket with patches. A sword hung at his back. A purse hung from his belt. His face was well-fed and haughty. He rode into the village as if he owned the place. He stopped in the middle of what Dan had already mentally dubbed the main street. He looked around. He saw chimneys sticking out of the roofs. He saw a new well lined with stone. He saw people working, not in the fields, but on the walls of houses. And he frowned. It was the tax collector for the barony of Haldrick. He came once a season to collect his share of the harvest and check whether anything unnecessary had taken root in the village. He usually took whatever he deemed excess as well. His name was Ferg. He dismounted from his horse and beckoned to Garrick. Garrick approached. Ferg asked what was going on here, why the houses didn't look the same as last time, why clay pipes were sticking out of the roofs, and what those red stones piled up by the stream were. Garrick answered evasively. He said they'd patched up the houses for winter. They'd found the stones by the river. The pipes were for smoke. Nothing special. Ferg didn't believe him. He walked through the village. He peeked into Mara's house. He saw a chimney. He saw a dry floor. He saw walls without mold. He went outside and asked who had done it. Mara remained silent. Ferg asked louder. She said they'd done it themselves. They'd learned how. Ferg wasn't a fool. He could see that the village had changed. Villages don't change on their own. People change them. Specific people. He gathered everyone in the square by the old well. He asked where the stranger was. One of the villagers said there was no stranger here. Ferg smiled a sinister smile. He said that rumors spread fast, that in the 3 villages to the south, people were already talking about some visiting craftsman who worked wonders with stone and clay, that Baron Howdrick was very interested in such craftsmen, that, according to baronial law, any craftsman without a guild mark was considered a fugitive and subject to arrest. Meanwhile, Dan was sitting in Myra's cellar. Isla had brought him there 10 minutes before Ferg rode into the village. She'd spotted the rider from the road and immediately ran to Dan. She said one word: hide. Dan didn't argue. He didn't know the local laws yet, but Isla's tone said it all. The cellar was dark and cramped, and it smelled of damp earth and last year's turnips. He sat there listening to the muffled voices upstairs. 3 kilns. Dan had built 3 kilns in 10 days. Each subsequent one was better than the last. The second kiln had double walls with an air gap and retained heat a quarter longer. The third was larger and could hold 120 raw bricks in a single load. Nell had perfected the clay mixture's composition: 3 parts clay from the riverbank, 1 part sand from the upper stream, chopped straw, and a secret additive she discovered on her own: ash from the kilns. The fine gray ash mixed with clay produced denser bricks with fewer cracks after firing. Dan looked at the result and mentally translated it: the pozzolanic reaction. Ash contains silica. At high temperatures, silica reacts with alumina to form a ceramic-like substance. Nell didn't know any of these words. She simply added the ash because she noticed that the bricks fired next to the coals were harder than the rest. Observation instead of theory. The result was the same. By the end of the 5th week, Dan had 480 bricks. Not 18,000, but enough for his first serious project. Not a house, not a wall, a grain storage shed. Currently, grain in the village was stored in pits covered with boards and straw. Mice ate a third of the supply. Moisture ruined another quarter. By spring, only half of the fall harvest remained. Every spring, the village went hungry. Not because the harvest was poor, but because they didn't know how to store it. Dan designed a granary. Rectangular, 4 paces by 6. The walls were made of a single row of bricks. The floor was raised above the ground on a stone foundation to keep moisture from rising from below. The roof was gabled and tiled. He didn't have any roof tiles, so he replaced them with fired clay tiles. The same technique as for bricks, only flat. Nell made 300 of them in a week. There's one door. It's solid, with a threshold higher than the knee so mice can't get through. There are ventilation slits under the ridge. Same principle applies. The house breathes. The barn breathes too. The whole crew worked on the construction. Brack hauled stones for the foundation from the stream. Oren dug the trench. Nell and her 2 apprentices mixed the mortar for the masonry. Dan stood over the trench and gave instructions. Here's the first row of stones. Here's the mortar. This is how we level it using the string. The string is stretched between two stakes with a level made from a bowl of water. If the water in the bowl is level, that means the string is horizontal. That means the row of stones will be horizontal. That means the wall will be straight. Garrick watched from a distance. Every day, he came a little closer. On the third day of construction, he was already standing just 5 steps away, watching every move. On the fourth day, he asked why the stones in the foundation were laid that way, with their long sides across the wall. Dan explained, "That way, the load is distributed evenly. If the stones were laid lengthwise, they might shift apart under the weight. Placed crosswise, they support each other." Garrick nodded. On the fifth day, he arrived with a tool, a heavy wooden hammer with a long handle. Without a word, he began helping to fit the stones into place. The barn was built in 12 days. It was low to the ground and sturdy, with red walls and a gray roof of fired tiles. It looked like a visitor from another world amid the crooked brown huts. People came to look at it. They touched the walls and tapped on them. The walls were warm to the touch from the sun and smooth from the mortar with which Nell had smoothed out the joints. Inside, it was dry and cool. Dan showed Garrick how to stack the grain in sacks on wooden pallets so that it wouldn't touch the floor or walls. Garrick silently carried the entire fall supply into the barn. 3 days later, a delegation of 4 families came to see Dan. They wanted the same kind of walls for their homes. No chimneys, no drainage. Walls. Red, warm, that don't rot or get wet. Dan explained that there weren't enough bricks yet, that it would take time, that the first houses to be built would be those of families with sick children. The delegation agreed, but they wanted to know when. Dan said after winter, if we survive the winter. Winter. It came sooner than he expected. The first snow fell at the beginning of the 3rd month. Light, thin, but the air already smelled of cold. Dan sped up the insulation work. The crews worked from dawn to dusk. Double walls filled with adobe. Every house, every single one, without exception. Lissa ran between the crews, counting how much each had done. She'd learned to count to 100 without even realizing it, simply because there were now more than 12 bricks and walls. But Dan wasn't thinking only about the walls. He was thinking about food. Insulated houses are good, but if there's nothing to eat, warm walls won't help. He asked Garrick how much grain was in the granary. Garrick answered. Dan did the math. 130 people, 4 months of winter. By his calculations, the grain would last 3 months, if they rationed it. There was almost no meat. There was little livestock. There was only enough milk for the children, and not even all of them. He went to see Isla. He asked what wild foods they could gather to stock up on before winter. Isla listed them. Roots, nuts, dried berries, mushrooms, and wild onions. She knew where everything grew. She'd been going into the woods her whole life. Dan asked her to organize the gathering. Everyone not working on the construction site goes into the forest to gather. We dry everything we can. We store everything we can. In the barn. In a dry, warm barn with a stone floor and ventilation. Isla nodded and left. 2 hours later, 15 people set off for the forest with baskets. Dan watched them go and thought about something else. About the dragon's back. The black cliffs above the village. The ruins of the Eleanor fortress. Stone. Cut stone that has lain there for 300 years. Waiting. He needs that stone. Not for bricks, for foundations. For walls that would be thicker and stronger than anything he could fire in his small kilns. Basalt doesn't need to be fired. It just needs to be quarried and hauled down. But to do that, he'd have to climb the dragon's back, to the place where the curse lies, to the place where no one had gone for 200 years. He climbed on the 61st day, alone, early in the morning while the village was still asleep. The trail was overgrown, so he fought his way through the brush and thorns, scratching his hands and face. The slope was steep. Basalt outcrops jutted from the ground like the ribs of a giant animal. He scrambled for 2 hours, and when he climbed out onto the flat summit, he stopped. The ruins were enormous. Not a village, a fortress. No, more than a fortress, a complex. Walls 3 times a man's height, made of hewn basalt blocks fitted together without mortar, so tightly that you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. Arches, real arches made of wedge-shaped stones converging on a keystone at the top. Dan walked up to the nearest one and placed his hand on the stone. It was warm. On the black basalt, in the mountain breeze on a cold morning, the stone was as warm as a living body. He walked on. Corridors, rooms without roofs, staircases leading to cellars, blocked by earth and stone. A plaza paved with slabs, each the size of a dining table. In the center of the plaza stood a column, broken. The upper part lay nearby, overgrown with moss, but the lower part still stood, and on it was a bas-relief. Dan stepped closer. The bas-relief depicted a city on a cliff, with towers, with an aqueduct, with terraces where trees grew. A city that had stood here 300 years ago, before the long winter. He walked around the ruins for 3 hours. He counted. He measured in steps. He estimated the thickness of the walls and the spans of the arches. And the more he looked, the more a strange feeling came over him. He recognized this layout, not because he'd seen it before. He couldn't have seen it before. But the arrangement of the buildings, their orientation relative to the cardinal directions, the width of the passageways, all of it matched exactly how he himself would have arranged the buildings if he'd designed a complex on this peak. It matched too perfectly. Then he found a block, in the far corner by a collapsed wall. A hewn basalt block lying face up. A drawing was carved into it. Lines, circles, rectangles. Dan crouched down and began to study it. And he felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the wind. It was a drainage system, a pit filled with gravel, a drain pipe, a ventilation shaft. The very same diagram he had drawn with a stick on the floor at Myra's house 60 days ago. The same diagram, the same proportions, the same elements. Carved into stone 300 years ago, long before he was born, long before the world he came from was born. He sat in front of that stone for a very long time. The wind blew. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows shifted, and there was something wrong with those shadows. They didn't move the way they should have in the sun's light. They lingered in the arches. They glided across the walls more slowly than they did across the ground, as if the stones remembered another sun or another time. He went down to the village toward evening, silent. Lissa ran up and asked where he'd been. He didn't answer. Ayla looked at his face and didn't ask anything. She just brought him some tea. He drank it without tasting it. Myra called him to dinner. He came. He sat down. He ate in silence. Tom climbed onto his lap, as he did every evening now. Dan mechanically hugged the boy and stared at the wall. Myra didn't ask. She had learned not to ask when his eyes looked like that, as if he weren't looking at the wall, but through it, through time. The stone changed everything. The basalt blocks from the summit of the Dragon's Back weighed between 20 and 50 kilograms each. 2 people could haul down 4 blocks a day along the trail that Dan had widened and paved with steps made of small stones. After a week, the trail became a road. After 2 weeks, it was so well trodden that even children could walk on it. Lissa walked there every day. She didn't carry stones. She kept count. How many blocks had been hauled down? How many were left up top? How many were needed for the foundation? Her birch bark scroll of notes grew, and by the third month, she could count to 400 without a hitch. Dan laid the foundation for the community house at the beginning of the third month. It was the first building he had truly designed from scratch. Not a renovation, not an addition, not a barn. A house where people would gather. A large one, 10 paces by 15. A foundation of basalt blocks, walls of brick set in lime mortar. He found the lime by chance. Ayla showed him a white stone by the upper stream. Dan picked up a piece and tested it with his teeth. Chalk. No. Softer than chalk. He split the stone open and examined the fracture. Limestone, a sedimentary rock. If burned at a high temperature, it would produce quicklime. If mixed with water, slaked lime. Masonry mortar. The very same kind the Romans used 2,000 years ago and that still stands today. He fired the first batch of limestone in the same kiln he'd used for the bricks. The stones turned white and brittle. He placed a piece in a wooden trough and carefully added water. The lime hissed. The water boiled. Steam rose in a column. Brack jumped back 3 steps. Oren cursed. Lissa squealed with delight. When the reaction was over, a white paste lay at the bottom of the trough. Slaked lime. Dan added sand. He stirred it. The result was a mortar. Thick. Sticky. Which, when it dried, became masonry stronger than any clay plaster. Nell was the first to try the mortar. She placed a brick on a layer of mortar, then a second brick on top. She pressed them together. She waited a day. She tried to pull them apart. She couldn't. The bricks held together as one solid piece. She looked at her hands. She looked at Dan. Her father had been making clay pots for 30 years and had never once thought to fire a stone and pour water over it. Yet this stranger had arrived 2 months ago and turned everything she knew about her craft upside down. She wasn't angry. She was grateful and a little stunned. The community house was taking shape slowly. Every row of bricks had to be aligned using a string line. Every corner was checked with a 3-4-5 square. Every horizontal joint was checked with a bowl of water. Dan wouldn't tolerate any crookedness. Not because he was a perfectionist, because a crooked wall is a weak wall, and a weak wall collapses. And there are people beneath a collapsed wall. He explained this to the crew over and over again. A straight wall isn't about beauty. A straight wall is about life. By the middle of the third month, the walls had risen to human height. And then Dan said a word that no one in the village knew. Arch. He wanted to build a vaulted ceiling, not a flat roof made of beams and straw that collapses under the weight of snow. A semicircular vault made of bricks that supports itself. One that distributes the load not downward, but outward. One that can bear 10 times the weight of a flat structure using the same amount of material. He spent 3 days explaining the principle to Brack. He drew on the ground. He sculpted models out of clay. He showed how the wedge-shaped bricks converged toward the keystone at the top, and how each brick pressed against the one next to it, and the next one pressed against it, and together they stood, because there was nowhere to fall. Brack listened. He frowned. He shook his head. Then he suddenly froze. He looked at his interlaced fingers. He had interlaced the fingers of both hands and tried to separate them without unclenching his fists. He couldn't do it. His fingers held each other in place, like bricks in an arch. He looked at Dan and said he understood. Dan smiled, for the first time in a week. An arch requires formwork, a temporary semicircular wooden frame onto which the bricks are laid. Once the arch is complete, the frame is removed and the arch stands on its own. There was only one carpenter in the village, Old Horst, 70 years old. His hands were knotted with arthritis, but his eye was sharp, and he had half a century of experience. Dan went to see him and explained what was needed. Horst listened in silence. Then he asked why they needed a rounded roof when a flat one would do. Dan said a flat one would collapse under the weight of the snow. Horst said that was true. He repairs 3 roofs every winter. Dan asked, what if we built it so it wouldn't need repairs? Horst gave him a long look. Then he stood up. He took out his tools, and he began to work. The formwork was ready in 4 days, rough but precise. Horst cut a semicircle out of thick planks and reinforced it with crossbeams. They installed it on the walls of the community house. Brack and Oren held it in place. Nell handed them the bricks. Dan stood below and directed them. Each brick was laid at an inward angle. Each joint was filled with lime mortar. Row by row, they worked on both the left and right side simultaneously to ensure the load was evenly distributed. It took 2 days. The keystone, the last brick at the top of the arch. Dan chose it himself. He shaped it into a wedge with a knife and a stone. He fitted it in place. He tested it. He adjusted it. He tested it again. Then he handed it to Brack. Brack stood on the formwork at the top. He took the brick in both hands and looked down at Dan. Dan nodded. Brack set the keystone in place. Silence. Then Dan said, "Take down the frame." Horst and Oren pulled the props out from under the formwork. The wooden frame dropped, and the vault remained. It hung in the air, held up by nothing, by bricks and mortar and geometry. Brack stood on the formwork that was no longer there. Beneath him was the floor. Above him was the vault. He raised his hand and touched the bricks above his head. They didn't move. He pressed down. They didn't move. They stood there, on their own. People were gathering, first the children, then the adults, then Garrick. They came inside and looked up. The arch was beautiful. Not in an architectural sense, truly beautiful. A semicircle of red brick on white mortar, rising upward and converging at a single point. Like an upside-down bowl. Like a stone sky. The old man from the far end of the village, the very one who had brought his granddaughter, stepped inside and stopped. He stood there, looking up. Then tears streamed down his face. He said that his great-grandfather had told him that in the old days, houses used to be like this, with a stone sky. He'd thought his great-grandfather was lying, that houses like that didn't exist, that stone couldn't hang in the air. His great-grandfather wasn't lying. Garrick was the last to enter. He stood there for a moment. He touched the wall. He touched the vaulted ceiling. He turned to Dan and said 4 words that changed everything. What else can you do? Not a question of suspicion, not a question of mockery. The question of a man who for the first time in 20 years saw that the world could be different. Dan answered, a lot. He can do a lot. Walls, towers, bridges, roads, water pipes, sewers, everything needed for people to live, not just survive. But for that, you need people. Not just 2 people a day, everyone, every day. There's not much time left before winter. Every day counts. Garrick was silent. Then he turned toward the village. He called the people together. They gathered. Garrick said that starting tomorrow, field work would be split evenly with construction work. Half the people in the fields, half on the construction site, every day. The blacksmith started to object. Garrick looked at him. The blacksmith fell silent. It wasn't the look of a village elder making a request. It was the look of a man who stood beneath a stone arch and realized that life could be different. Dan got his men, 20 men a day instead of 2. He divided them into crews. Each crew worked on a single task. The first continued insulating the houses. The second hauled stone down from the mountaintop. The third molded and fired bricks. The fourth dug trenches for future foundations. The fifth gathered firewood for the kiln. The assembly line was running at full capacity. Dan darted back and forth between the crews. He demonstrated, he corrected, he explained. He cursed when a wall was going askew. He praised them when a row was laid straight. Lissa ran after him with birch bark and wrote down everything in a row. The curses, the praise, the numbers, the names. She became his living notebook. Meanwhile, Isla was doing her part. She organized a group of 7 women for foraging. They went into the forest every morning and returned with baskets full of roots, nuts, and mushrooms. Isla dried the herbs in her converted drying shed, and they no longer grew moldy. She discovered new recipes for herbal decoctions using the knowledge about air and moisture that Dan had shared with her. One of the decoctions relieved children's fevers better than anything the old herbalist had ever known. Another helped with coughs. She didn't know the word antiseptic, but she found a herbal mixture that could be used to wash wounds so they wouldn't fester. Dan noticed something else. Relationships in the village were changing. The rift he'd sensed from the very beginning was deepening. The young people were drawn to him. Brock and Oren followed him around as if he were a teacher. Nell copied the way he examined the wall, squinting and tilting his head. Even Lissa had started using his words. Load-bearing beam, angle of deflection, horizon. Words that hadn't existed in the language of Clay Ford 3 months ago. The older generation watched this with growing unease. The blacksmith grumbled openly. An old village priestess named Bernice cursed the new houses every morning. She said the gods did not favor those who rose above their station. 3 families refused to insulate their homes. They said their grandfathers had lived that way, and so would they. Dan didn't argue. He didn't force anyone, but he saw the rift deepening and knew that sooner or later he would have to do something about it. Meanwhile, he kept building. The community house got doors, heavy ones made of oak planks fastened with iron strips that the blacksmith had made. Yes, the blacksmith, the very same one who had grumbled and scolded the stranger. He made the strips because Garrick had asked him to, and because it was metalwork. And metalwork was his life. And when he saw how his strips fit onto the oak planks and how the door sat perfectly and precisely in the stone opening, he stood there for a minute and then left. He didn't say a word, but the next day he brought Dan a set of iron staples. Without a word, he set them down and left. The staples were needed to fasten the beams to the walls. Dan hadn't asked for them. The blacksmith figured out on his own that they were needed. That was the beginning. The first snow fell thickly in the middle of the 3rd month. Dan stood on the threshold of the community house and watched as a white blanket settled over the village. Chimneys jutted out from every roof. Smoke rose from each one, straight, even smoke rising into the sky rather than spreading through the rooms. The walls of the houses were double layered, with a layer of adobe in between. The granary stood red and sturdy, filled with grain. On the trail to the dragon's back lay fresh snow, covering steps that hadn't existed 3 months earlier. Winter set in during the 3rd week after the first snowfall. It wasn't the mild, thaw-filled winter Dan remembered from Chicago. This winter was like a war. The temperature dropped every day. The north wind carried icy pellets that stung his face and seeped into every crevice. The snow had piled up to 1.5 times a person's height in the first month. The trail to the dragon's back had vanished beneath the white blanket. The stream had frozen over. The old well in the hollow was covered with a crust of ice that had to be broken up every morning. But the new well hadn't frozen. Dan noticed this on the 5th day of the cold snap. The water in the upper well remained liquid, not warm, but liquid. He reached down to check. The water's temperature was higher than it should have been for such a cold snap. He attributed it to the well's depth. Deep groundwater maintains a more stable temperature. A logical explanation. Correct. And incomplete. But he didn't know that yet. The houses stayed warm. The double walls with a layer of adobe in between worked. The chimneys worked. Inside the huts, it wasn't hot, but it was bearable. People slept not in fur coats, but under blankets. For Clay Ford, this was an unprecedented luxury. The three families who had refused to insulate their homes came to Dan a week after the real cold snap set in. Silently, without apologies. They simply arrived and stood by the community house. He nodded and sent Brack with a crew. Within 2 days, all three houses were insulated. No one else refused. The stove in Myra's house was acting strangely. Dan noticed this when he went in to check the chimney after a blizzard. Myra said that an armful of firewood lasted half a day. Previously, the same amount had lasted 4 hours in her house. Dan checked the draft. Normal. He checked for drafts. None. He checked the chimney. It was clear. He couldn't find an explanation. An armful of firewood can't burn 1.5 times longer just like that. The heat capacity of wood is a constant. He made a mental note of it and moved on. The community hall became the center of the village. Every evening, people gathered under the vaulted ceiling. The red brick vault retained heat better than any roof. Inside, a hearth with a chimney was burning. People sat on the benches Horst had whacked together. They ate together. They talked. For the first time in years, the village had a place where everyone could gather without freezing. Dan usually sat by the wall and sketched on a piece of birch bark. Lissa sat next to him and tried to figure out what he was drawing. He was drawing Irishtal. He hadn't named it that yet. He hadn't thought of it as a city yet, but the lines on the birch bark were forming a plan. The peak of the dragon's back, a flat clearing, ruins along the perimeter. If they cleared away the rubble and cleared the foundations, there would be enough space for a full-fledged settlement. The walls of the Eleanor fortress could be restored. Not from scratch, just build up over the remaining foundations. Water would be drawn from the lower stream through a system of gutters and cisterns. Terraces on the southern slope for vegetable gardens. A tower at the northern tip for observation. He sketched, and the world around him faded away. All that remained were lines and proportions and the quiet joy of seeing the plan take shape. Isla would sit across from him and watch, not at the drawing, at his hands. At the way they moved, confidently, precisely, as if the lines already existed in the air and he was simply tracing them. She brought him tea every evening. The blend varied. When he was tired, the tea invigorated him. When he was tense, the tea calmed him. Dan asked how she knew. Isla shrugged and said she could tell. He didn't ask what exactly she saw. There was something in her gaze that told him not to ask. In the 6th week of winter, a child died. Not from the cold, not from hunger, from a fall. An 8-year-old boy climbed onto the roof of a house to shovel off the snow and slipped. He fell 2.5 meters onto the frozen ground, his back. Ayla did everything she could. Dan stood nearby and felt utterly useless. His knowledge couldn't heal a broken spine. His arches and chimneys were of no help when the boy stopped moving his legs and then stopped breathing. The boy's name was Fed. He was the son of one of the guys who had helped dig the first well. The village buried Feder on a hill beyond the stream, in the frozen ground they'd been chiseling away at for 2 hours. Dan stood off to the side. He didn't know the local customs. He didn't know what to say. The old priestess Bernice performed the ritual. Then she turned to Dan, and she said in front of everyone that it was his fault, that the gods were punishing the village for its ungodly stone walls, that in the past the roofs had been low and children didn't fall, but now the houses were tall and children were dying. Garrick remained silent. He didn't intervene. Dan understood why. Garrick had no argument against a dead child. No chimney and no well could outweigh a coffin. People were looking at Dan. He saw in their eyes what he'd feared from day one: doubt, as subtle as a crack in the foundation. But cracks grow. He didn't answer Bernice. He went into the shed. He sat there until dark. Then he stood up. He took some birch bark and a stick, and he began sketching railings, roof railings. Not very high, waist high, made of poles and ropes. That would keep a child from falling. That would keep anyone from falling. In the morning, he went to see Fetter's father. The man was sitting by the cold hearth. Dan laid the drawing in front of him. He said that Fetter had died because there was no railing on the roof, that it was a mistake he had made, and that he would fix it, on every house. Fetter's father looked at the blueprint for a long time. Then he looked at Dan. Then he nodded. Within a week, railings had appeared on every roof in the village. Bernice watched in silence. She was waiting for a new sign from the gods. The sign didn't come. The children stopped falling. Bernice didn't apologize, but she stopped cursing the walls in the mornings. Winter dragged on. Dan couldn't build. The frost made it impossible to lay bricks. The mortar froze before it could set. It was impossible to haul stone down from the summit. The trail was blocked. He used the time to teach. Every evening in the community hall, he gathered his crew and taught them. He drew on birch bark. He explained the principles: load, weight distribution, foundation, center of gravity. Brack picked it up faster than anyone else. He began to see buildings the way Dan saw them, not as walls, but as systems of forces, where the weight presses, where the fulcrum is, where the weak spot lies. Nell worked all winter. She molded raw bricks and stacked them in the community house to dry. By spring, they would have a supply ready for firing: 3,000 bricks. She had perfected the process to mechanical precision. Every brick was the same size, the same thickness, and the same weight. Dan measured 10 random bricks from different batches. The deviation didn't exceed the width of a finger. For work done by hand, without a single measuring tool other than a piece of rope with knots, it was astonishing. One night in the middle of winter, Dan woke up to a strange sensation: warmth. It was warm in his shed. Not just not cold, but warm. He was lying on straw and could feel the warmth rising from below, from the ground. He pressed his palm against the floor. The ground was warm. Not hot, but distinctly warmer than the frozen soil should have been in the dead of winter. He got up. He went outside. The frost was bitter. The stars burned brightly and menacingly. And beneath his feet, the ground was warm. Dan unfolded the map on the table in the community hall. He had replaced the birch bark with leather. Isla had begged a hunter for a bull's hide, tanned it, and stretched it over a frame. Dan had drawn a map on this leather. The village below, the slope, the trail, the summit of the Dragon's Back. And at the summit, the city. He spent 3 hours showing it to Garrick and the elders. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. The lowland where the village stands is unfit for life. It has always been unfit. The water table is high. The soil is waterlogged. Every spring brings flooding. Every fall brings dampness. Every winter brings freezing. They survive here not because of the place, but in spite of it. The summit of the Dragon's Back is different. A flat plateau 300 paces long and 150 wide. A rocky foundation. No waterlogging. The wind blows through, but the walls provide shelter from it. A view in all 4 directions. No one can approach unnoticed. Stone underfoot. Stone in the surrounding walls. And the old Eleanor foundations that have stood for 300 years and will stand for another 300. The blacksmith asked how to bring water up to the top. Dan replied, an aqueduct, a system of troughs from the upper stream on the western slope. The stream gushes from the rock, at a height sufficient for the water to flow by gravity down an inclined trough to the summit. No mechanisms, just the right slope and the right materials. The blacksmith asked what an aqueduct was. Dan said it was a bridge for water. The blacksmith looked at him as if he were mad. Then he looked up at the vaulted ceiling and said nothing. Bernice stood up and declared that no one was allowed to climb the dragon's back, that it was a cursed place, that the Eleanori had angered the gods, and the gods had brought down their empire, that whoever touched their stones would share their fate. Dan listened. Then he asked one thing. Had she been up there? Bernice said no. Dan asked if anyone present had been up there. No one had. Dan asked how, then, they knew the place was cursed. Bernice said that's what their grandfathers had said. Dan said that their grandfathers had also said the water in the old well was safe, and that smoke in the house was normal, and that children were just that weak. A thick silence hung in the air. Bernice flushed. Garrick raised his hand. He said he would make a decision in the morning. The people dispersed. In the morning, Garrick came to Dan, alone. He sat down next to him. He said that half the village would follow the stranger upstairs. The other half wouldn't. He asked what to do. Dan said he wouldn't force anyone. Those who want to go upstairs can go. Those who don't want to stay downstairs. No one is forcing anyone. No one is holding anyone back. But up there will be walls. Up there will be safety. And when the horde comes, those down below can come up at any time. The door will be open. Garrick nodded. He stood up and announced, 12 of the 23 families decided to go up. The remaining 11 stayed behind. Bernice stayed. The blacksmith stayed. The 3 families of elders stayed behind. The split ran exactly along the fault line that Dan had seen from day one. The young went up. The old stayed down. It hurt. He had been building for everyone, for each and every one. But it turned out he had divided them. Work began on the first warm day. They cleared the trail of snow and widened it to 2 paces. Brack suggested cutting steps directly into the rock on the steepest sections. Dan agreed. Oren found a crack in the basalt halfway up, and they drove wooden wedges into it. They poured water into it. Overnight, the water froze and widened the crack. In the morning, a chunk of rock broke off. A clean, smooth chip. A ready-made step. Oren looked at the result and said that stone obeys water. Dan didn't bother explaining the properties of ice as it freezes. He just nodded. At the summit, Dan laid out the plan. Ropes, pegs, lines of lime dust on the rock, a communal square in the center, residential buildings along the eastern and western edges, workshops by the northern wall, storage areas by the southern wall, an aqueduct from the west, a water cistern in the center of the square next to the well he planned to drill into the rock, a wall around the entire perimeter, not a new wall, a restored Eleanor wall. The foundations were still standing. The lower rows of stones were still in place. All that was needed was to build up from there. The first month of spring was spent clearing the site. 300 years worth of debris, dirt, stones, tree roots growing through the masonry, animal bones, shards of pottery, scraps of what had once been fabric, and stones. Hundreds of hewn basalt blocks lay scattered wherever they had fallen when the upper tiers of the walls collapsed. Dan inspected every block. He set aside the intact ones for construction. The damaged ones were crushed into gravel. The completely destroyed ones were discarded. While clearing the north wall, Oren found a cellar. A stone staircase led down, half buried in rubble. They cleared the entrance in 2 days. Dan went down first, carrying a torch. The cellar turned out to be a long corridor with niches in the walls. Stone cylinders stood in the niches, sealed. Dan carefully opened one. Inside were scrolls. Not parchment, something thinner and stronger, a material he couldn't identify. The scrolls contained blueprints, detailed, precise, with dimensions and annotations in a language Dan didn't know. But he could read the blueprints. The blueprints were universal. One scroll depicted a water supply system, an aqueduct, a cistern, distribution channels, exactly what Dan had planned to build, only more complex, more precise, with details he hadn't thought through. A filtration chamber with 3 layers of gravel of different sizes, an emergency overflow in case of overfilling, a backup cistern in the basement. He looked at these drawings and felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Not out of fear, out of recognition. He knew that hand, that style, that way of drawing lines, sweeping and confident, with a characteristic pressure at the end of each line. It was his hand. He rolled up the scrolls and carried them upstairs. He didn't show them to anyone. He put them in a bag and hid them in a niche in the wall, which he sealed with a stone. He needed time to think. Time he didn't have, because work wouldn't wait. Construction of the aqueduct began in the middle of the 2nd month of spring. Dan found a stream on the western slope. It gushed from a crevice at a height that provided a 15-meter drop to the summit, enough for gravity flow. The trough was made of fired clay tiles laid on stone supports. The slope was 1 finger per 10 steps, even and steady. The water flows slowly but steadily. It doesn't stop. It doesn't overflow. It just flows. Nell made the tiles for the trough, semicircular in cross-section, with curved edges. Each one overlapped the next so that water wouldn't seep through the joints. She invented a way to seal them, a mixture of clay and fat, thick as oil. She packed it into the joints, and the seam became watertight. Dan looked at her invention and mentally translated it. Mastic, sealant. Nell had created a sealant in the Bronze Age, from clay and animal fat. He told her she was a genius. She didn't understand the word. He said she was smarter than anyone in the village, including him. She blushed and went off to mold the next tile. Brack was erecting the stone supports for the aqueduct. They were made of basalt blocks set in lime mortar. Every 10 steps, there was a pillar ranging in height from 0.5 meter to 3 meters, depending on the terrain. 27 pillars. The trough rested on them like a road on bridges. The total length of the aqueduct, from the stream to the cistern at the top, was 400 steps. It took a month to build. Dan hadn't slept properly the entire month. Every day he was on his feet from dawn to dusk. Isla would come by in the evening and make him drink her tea. He drank it. She would sit down next to him and say nothing. Sometimes she'd ask what he was thinking about. He'd tell her about the aqueduct, about the slope, about the water pressure, about how every mistake in the gradient means a leak, and a leak means a washed-out foundation. And a washed-out foundation means a collapse. She listened so intently that Dan sometimes forgot he was talking to a 19-year-old herb gatherer and not a colleague from the office. Once, she asked if there were aqueducts for air. Dan paused. He thought for a moment. Ventilation shafts, he said. There are such things. Isla nodded and said she wanted to build one for her new drying shed up on the hill. Dan laughed for the first time in 3 weeks. The relocation took 3 weeks, 23 families, 130 people, livestock, grain, tools. Everything they could carry was hauled up the steps. Brack organized a chain of porters. 10 people stood on the trail at equal intervals, passing bags and bales to one another. It was faster than if everyone had carried them alone. Dan hadn't suggested this method. Brack had come up with it himself. Dan looked at the chain and realized that his best student had started thinking in terms of systems. At the top stood 6 finished houses, small ones, stone walls, arched roofs, chimneys. 4 more houses were still under construction. The rest of the families lived in temporary shelters made of animal hides and poles set up between the alieno walls. Not ideal, but the walls blocked the wind and the hides kept out the rain. And most importantly, it was dry up there. The rocky foundation didn't hold water. It ran down through the cracks. No mud, no puddles underfoot. The children ran on stone, not through a swamp. The blacksmith was the last to climb up. His name was Volg. He didn't want to go. But the forge down below, without people, was pointless. There was no one to fill orders, no one to pay him. He dismantled the forge. He hauled the anvil upstairs on a cart made of 2 poles. He set up the new forge by the north wall. Dan assigned him a spot next to the workshops, far enough from the living quarters so sparks wouldn't fly onto the roofs, and next to the stone warehouse so he wouldn't have to carry the metal far. Volg grumbled the first week, the second, the third. Then he fell silent. Because his new smithy stood on a stone floor under a stone canopy with a chimney that drew like a beast. For the first time in his life, he worked without having to duck from the smoke. For the first time, he saw the workpiece in normal light rather than through tears. He didn't thank Dan, but he made him a pickaxe, a heavy one, with a long handle, for working with basalt, without being asked, without a word. Dan used the pickaxe that very same day. He began digging a well in the rock. The aqueduct provided water but was vulnerable. One winter, one landslide, one enemy unit that breaks the pillar, and the summit would be left without water. A backup source was needed. A hole in the rock down to the groundwater. He calculated the depth based on the slope's angle and the stream's elevation. About 12 meters, maybe 15, maybe 20. Basalt is hard. Chiseling through it by hand is hell. But there's no other way. The 4 of us dug. Dan, Brack, Oren, and the new guy, Talc, 20 years old, from one of the families that made it to the top first. Quiet, strong, with a face that gave nothing away. But when he struck with his pickaxe, the rock flew. They took turns chiseling away at the rock, 2 hours each. They dug down a palm's width a day, sometimes less. The basalt didn't give in easily. At a depth of 3 meters, Dan stumbled upon a void. The pickaxe plunged into thin air, and he nearly fell into the hole. He stopped. He shone his torch. Beneath the rock was a cavity, man-made, smoothly hewn walls, a square cross-section, a corridor leading into the darkness, Alino's underground level. Dan went down. The corridor led south. After 20 paces, it widened into a chamber. In the chamber stood a stone basin 4 paces in diameter, empty. But the bowl's walls were covered with water stains. It was a cistern, an underground cistern. The Eleanori stored water beneath the rock, so there was water here. Or there had been. He tapped on the walls. He listened. On the eastern wall, the sound was different, deeper. As if behind the stone there was not rock, but emptiness, or liquid. Dan took his pickaxe and struck, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th strike, water began to flow from the wall, a thin trickle, then a thicker stream, clear, cold. He cupped his hand, tasted it. No aftertaste, no smell. Groundwater that had passed through meters of basalt, filtered by the rock itself. By evening, the trickle had turned into a stream. The cistern began to fill. Dan marked the wall. Overnight, the water level rose by 3 fingers' width. He calculated the volume of the basin. At this rate, the cistern would provide enough water for 150 people, even if the aqueduct failed. He climbed back up, wet, dirty, and happy. Brack looked at his face and asked what was there. Dan said, "Water." Brack closed his eyes and exhaled. Construction picked up speed. 20 people on the job site every day. The walls of the houses were rising. Each house followed the same design, rectangular, 4 by 6 paces. 2 windows, 1 door, a chimney, a vaulted ceiling. Dan standardized the design so that the crews could build without his constant supervision. Brack led one crew, Oren led another, Tauk led the third. Nell oversaw the production of bricks and mortar, Isla was in charge of supplies, Lissa kept the accounts. Dan worked on the wall. The perimeter wall was the main project. Not for beauty, it was for survival. Scouts from the Grey Wolf Horde had been here 6 months ago. They'd seen a low brick wall surrounding the village in the valley. Now the village in the valley is gone, but the Horde doesn't know that. When they arrive and see the empty valley, they'll look up, and they'll see the walls on the cliff, and they'll decide what to do. The wall rose from an Aelinorian foundation. The bottom 2 meters consisted of the original blocks, basalt fitted together without mortar. Dan built up the wall with bricks, row by row, with buttresses every 20 steps. A buttress is a projection of the wall extending outward, like a tree root that keeps the trunk from falling. It absorbs the lateral load and transfers it to the foundation. Without buttresses, a tall wall would collapse under a battering ram. With buttresses, it would hold. Maybe. Ren Kim arrived when the wall was halfway up. She appeared from below along the trail, alone, with a bag of tools on her back and stone dust in her short hair. The daughter of the head mason from the village of Upper Karn, a 3-day journey to the southeast. She had heard the story, not from travelers, from a merchant who was passing by and said that in Clayford, a stranger was building houses out of fired clay on the cliff. Ren didn't believe it. She went to see for herself. It wasn't the Horde. Not yet, anyway. 30 horsemen under the banner of the Barony of Haldrick kicked up dust. They rode up to the empty valley where the village had once stood. They stopped. They wandered among the abandoned huts. Then one of them looked up, at the walls, at the red brick and black basalt, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the banner that wasn't there, because Clayford had no banner, but which should have been hung, because this was no longer a village. Dan stood on the wall and counted. 30 horsemen, mounted, armed, swords, spears. 3 of them had bows, leather armor. Not an army, a detachment, an embassy with teeth. At the head rode a man in a cloak trimmed with fur. Not Ferg, someone older, more important. Garrett climbed up onto the wall. He looked down. He turned pale. He said it was the Baron, Haldrick himself, in person. That's bad. Barons don't come to villages in person. Barons come to those they intend to crush or subjugate, or buy off. Haldrick rode up to the foot of the cliff. He stopped at the start of the trail. He looked at the steps carved into the rock, at the wall above, at the gate. Then he shouted. His voice was deep and resonant, accustomed to giving orders. He said that Baron Haldrick demanded an audience with the village headman of Clayford, and with the master builder who was constructing these walls. Garrick looked at Dan. Dan thought. He couldn't hide any longer. Ferg had stolen the bricks. The Baron had come in person. He knew. Running from the Baron meant becoming a fugitive, and a fugitive could be hunted down. A manhunt could be called. Soldiers could be sent. And the Baron had more than 30 soldiers, many more. Dan said he'd go out. Garrick opened his mouth, closed it, then said he'd go with him. Brack said he would too. Ren grabbed her stonemason's hammer and said she'd just stand nearby, with the hammer. Dan looked at them and nodded. They went down, the 4 of them. Dan, Garrick, Brack, Ren. Haldrick was waiting for them at the foot of the trail. Up close, he turned out to be a man in his 50s. Not very tall, with a neat beard, with eyes that took everything in. The number of steps, the thickness of the wall, the number of people on the wall. He calculated just like Dan did. Only he wasn't calculating loads and proportions. He was calculating cost. How much it was worth. How much could be taken. How much could be earned. Haldrick dismounted. He walked over to Dan. He looked him up and down. He asked if he was a master craftsman. Dan said he was an architect. Howdrick didn't know that word. Dan said he was the one who builds. Howdrick nodded. Then he said three things. First, according to the barony's law, any master working within the baron's territory without a guild license is a fugitive and subject to arrest. Second, a structure taller than 2 human heights, built without the baron's permission, is an illegal fortification. Third, the baron is willing to overlook the first 2 points if the master agrees to work for the barony, a salary, housing in the capital, a workshop, apprentices, everything a master needs. But the master works for the baron, only for the baron. Dan listened. He weighed the options, not the workload, the consequences. If he agrees, he'll leave Clay Ford. Construction will stop. The walls are unfinished. The houses are only half built. The aqueduct is vulnerable. The horde will arrive in a few months. Without him, these people won't have time to prepare. If he refuses, the Baron could declare him a criminal, send in the army, lay siege to the cliff. Dan has walls, but few people, no weapons. Supplies won't last through a long siege. He chose the third option. He looked at Haldrick and said that he wasn't a master builder. He's an architect. He doesn't lay stones. He draws how to lay them. The stones are laid by the people of Clay Ford, 20 men. Each of them is trained, and each of them can build without him. If the Baron wants to take him away, the walls will still go up, because the knowledge is no longer in his head. It's in 20 heads. He'll have to take them all. Howdrick was silent. He hadn't expected that argument. He'd expected a lone master who could be plucked from his environment and relocated. Not a school, not a system. Then he smiled, subtly, and said it was interesting. And he offered an alternative. Don't take the master away. Sign a treaty. The barony of Howdrick recognizes Clay Ford as a vassal settlement with the right to self-governance and fortification. In return, the master sends 2 apprentices to the barony's capital for guild training. And once a year, he completes 1 construction project commissioned by the baron. The tax is halved. Dan thought quickly. This was better than he'd expected. Recognition of vassalage meant protection. Nominal, but protection nonetheless. Fortification would become legal. The tax would be halved. 2 apprentices to the capital? They'll teach the barony how to build. In 5 years, Howdrick would have his own masons. In 10, his own walls. Dan would be creating a competitor for himself. But in 10 years, Iristal would stand. And in another 10 years, the world would change. He agreed. On one condition, the apprentices would leave after winter. Not now. Right now, every pair of hands counted. Howdrick looked at the wall, at the buttresses, at the arched gate. And he agreed. He wasn't a fool. He saw the value. And he understood that value that grows is worth more than value that's plucked while still green. The Baron left. Dan climbed up onto the wall and stood there until dark. Ren approached and stood beside him. She asked why he wasn't happy. Dan said that the 2 apprentices were Oren and Nell, the best after Brack. Without them, construction would slow down. Ren was silent for a moment. Then she said that she alone was worth 3 Orens. Dan looked at her and realized she wasn't joking. Summer was drawing to a close. The walls were up. The houses were taking shape. 18 out of 23 were ready. People had moved from their temporary shelters into stone houses with vaulted ceilings. The aqueduct was working. The cistern was full. The underground spring provided water without interruption. The workshops were in full swing. Volg was forging staples, hinges, and tooltips. Nell was stamping bricks like a woman possessed, building up a stockpile for the fall. Ayla had set up an infirmary in a separate building with herbs on the shelves, clean linen bandages, whitewashed walls, and a large window to let in light. Dan began building a tower, not a residential one, but a watchtower, at the northern tip of the summit. It had a square base, 3 by 3 paces, and stood 7 meters tall, with 4 levels, each featuring a vaulted ceiling. The walls were thick, 1.5 bricks deep, loopholes on every level. A staircase inside, a spiral staircase made of stone steps set into the wall. Each step was a corbel, projecting from the wall and supporting its own weight and that of a person, without a central support or a wooden frame, just stone. Ren was building the tower. She understood the principle of the cantilever right away. The step had to be longer on the inside of the wall than on the outside. Then the wall would hold it just as a hand holds a stick. If the stick is long on the inside of the fist and short on the outside, it won't slip out. Ren explained it to her crew exactly like that. A stick and a fist. The crew understood. The tower grew, meter by meter. Dan stood below and gave directions. Ren stood at the top and laid the stones. They shouted back and forth. He'd yell, "To the left!" She'd shout, "Come up here yourself and check it!" He'd climb up, he'd check. It turned out perfectly level. Every single time, it was level. Ren laid stone better than anyone in Clayford, including Dan. He knew how. She had the skill. By the end of summer, the tower stood, 7 meters tall. From the platform at the top, you could see in 3 directions as far as the eye could see. To the south, as far as the road from the barony. To the east, as far as the mountain passes from which the horde would come. To the west, as far as the forest and beyond. Only to the north was the view blocked by a mountain ridge. Dan climbed up to the platform and looked east. There was no dust. Not yet. But a merchant who'd passed through the lowlands a week ago had said that the Grey Wolf horde had taken 2 villages beyond the pass, burned them, slaughtered the inhabitants, left their heads on stakes. It was heading west, toward them. 2 months, maybe 3, maybe sooner. Dan climbed down from the tower and called a council. Garrick, Brack, Ren, Volg, Isla, Lissa, who kept the records. He spread out the map he'd drawn over the summer. All the approaches to the cliff, all the trails, all the roads. He marked the weak spots. The southern slope was gentle. A large force could climb it. We need a second wall, or a moat, or both. The eastern slope is steep, but there's a trail he'd widen to haul rocks down. If the enemy finds it, they can climb up quickly. The trail needs to be blocked, or turned into a trap. Volga listened in silence. Then he said something Dan hadn't expected. He said he knew how to make arrowheads. Lots of them. Quickly. But he needed iron. There's not much iron in the village. Merchants bring it in once a season. Dan thought for a moment. Then he remembered. The Elino ruins. In the cellar he'd found, there were niches. Some contained stone cylinders that he hadn't opened. Maybe. The next day, he went down to the cellar. He opened 3 more cylinders. One contained scrolls. Another held tools, bronze ones, chisels and gouges for working with stone. They were in perfect condition, as if they'd been placed there yesterday. The third contained ingots, not bronze, not copper, iron. Solid, heavy, rust-free. Eleanor iron that had remained corrosion-free for 300 years. Dan hauled the ingots upstairs, 12 of them, each about the size of a palm. Volg took one, turned it over in his hands, tested it with his fingernail. He looked at Dan with an expression Dan had never seen before on that perpetually sullen face. Delight. The pure, professional delight of a blacksmith holding the finest metal he'd ever worked with. Volg began forging the spearheads that very hour. Dan set about fortifying the defenses. The southern slope, a ditch. Not deep, 2 meters, but with sheer walls lined with stone and stakes at the bottom. Everyone dug, even Bernice. She didn't announce it, she just grabbed a shovel and joined the line. Dan saw her and said nothing. Dan had turned the trail on the eastern slope into a deadly trap. He narrowed it to the width of a single person. On the steep sections, he removed the steps, leaving only smooth rock. At the top, where the trail emerged onto a clearing, he built a stone wall with loopholes. 3 archers behind that wall could hold the trail against 100, because only one person could walk the trail at a time, and anyone who climbed up put their head in the line of fire. They arrived at the beginning of winter. Not the entire horde, an advance guard, 200 horsemen. Dan saw them from the tower at dawn, a dark mass against the white snow. It moved slowly, stretching out along the road. Horsemen, with spears, with shields covered in animal hides. A gray banner bearing the black silhouette of a wolf. He climbed down and sounded the alarm. The horn that Volg had fashioned from a bull's horn bellowed across the mountaintop. The men ran to the walls, not in panic, in an orderly fashion. Everyone knew their place. Dan had positioned them 3 weeks earlier. He conducted drills every day. Brock on the north wall with 10 men. Ren on the south wall with 12. Oren at the eastern path with 3 archers. Talk at the west gate. Garrick was at the northern gate. Volg was in the smithy. He didn't fight. He forged. Arrowheads, staples, fasteners, everything they needed right now. Isla gathered the women and children in the community hall. The infirmary was ready. Bandages, herbal decoctions, tools. She wasn't a healer, she was an herbalist. But in the year she'd spent with Dan, she'd learned one thing: to do what needed to be done with what was at hand. Without panic, without tears. Just do it. Lissa stood on the wall next to Dan. He told her to come down. She refused. He repeated himself. She said she was his notebook and that a notebook should stay with its owner. Dan looked at her. She was 13 years old, skinny, with a birch bark scroll tucked under her arm. Her eyes showed no fear because she didn't yet know what to be afraid of. He didn't argue. He pointed out a spot behind a crenel in the wall where she would be hidden. She sat down and took out the birch bark scroll. The horsemen rode up to the hollow. They dismounted. They surveyed the empty huts. Some of the huts had collapsed over the winter, left untended. The rest stood crooked and dark, a dead village. One of the horsemen set a hut on fire. The straw burst into flames instantly. The rest caught fire in quick succession. An hour later, nothing remained of Glignani Broad. Black ruins smoldered on the white snow. Then they looked up. They stared for a long time. Walls on a black cliff. Red brick set in white mortar. A tower. Smoke rising from the chimneys. The gates were closed. People on the walls. This was not what they had expected. They had expected a filthy village in a valley that could be taken in half an hour, not a fortress on a cliff. The squad commander sent 5 men to the foot of the path. They climbed 30 steps. Then they saw that the path was narrowing. Then they saw a wall with loopholes at the top. An arrowhead was sticking out of one of the loopholes. They stopped. They stood there for a moment. Then they went back down. The commander rode around the rock. Dan watched him from the tower. The commander stopped at 4 points. The southern slope, the moat. The commander looked at the moat and turned his horse around. The western slope, a 20-meter-high sheer basalt wall. Impossible. The northern slope, steep but passable. Dan had been expecting this. On the northern slope, he had set up decoys, stones stacked in pyramids. From a distance, they looked like bastions. Up close, nothing. But the commander didn't ride close enough to check. By noon, the detachment had retreated. 200 horsemen rode off to the east. They didn't storm the fortress. They didn't even try. 200 men can't take a fortress on a cliff. That would require more. Much more. Ladders, battering rams, time, food, a willingness to lose men. 200 scouts weren't ready. Dan stood on the wall and watched them leave. Ren stood beside him. She was clutching her hammer with both hands. Her knuckles were white. Dan looked at her. He said they would leave. Ren said she knew, and that they would return, with the rest of them. Dan nodded. Garrett climbed up onto the wall. He stood beside him. He was silent. Then he said quietly, "The wall held." Dan replied that the wall hadn't yet withstood an assault. The wall was still standing, but they hadn't stormed it. Those were two different things. Garrick shook his head. He said that for Clayford, this was the first time the enemy had looked at their homes and left. The first time in all of history. Usually, they came, took what they wanted, and left. But today, they left with nothing. Because of the walls. Because of the stone. Because a single man with a stick had drawn lines in the mud a year ago. Dan didn't answer. He was thinking about something else. About the fact that 200 was just the vanguard. According to rumors, the Grey Wolf horde numbered between 3,000 and 5,000. When the entire horde arrived, his walls might not hold. He needed time. He needed to reinforce the southern slope. He needed more people. The people came on their own. Over the next 2 weeks, refugees arrived at the foot of the dragon's back. Families from the villages the horde had burned beyond the pass, exhausted, hungry, carrying children in their arms and with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The first group, 15 people, then another 20, then more. By the end of the month, 60 people were standing at the foot of the mountain, begging to be let in. Garrick hesitated. 60 mouths to feed. There wasn't enough grain. There was enough water, but no food. Dan didn't hesitate. He told them to open the gates. Garrick asked what they would feed them. Dan said that 60 people meant 30 pairs of hands. 30 pairs of hands meant a wall on the southern slope in a month. A wall on the southern slope meant survival for everyone. We'll find something to feed them. Ren stepped forward and said there were masons among the refugees. 3 of them. She'd seen their hands as they climbed. A mason recognizes a mason's hands. The gates opened. 60 people climbed the steps. The children looked at the walls, at the arches, at the tower, at the aqueduct, at the stone houses with vaulted roofs from which smoke was rising. A girl of about 7 stopped in the middle of the square and looked up at the vaulted ceiling of the community hall. She stood there and watched. Then she turned to her mother and said that it was a sky made of stone. An old man standing nearby had heard those same words from his great-grandfather. He turned away. Dan settled the refugees, some in houses where there was room, some in temporary shelters. Isla examined everyone. 3 were sick. 1 was wounded, a burn on his arm. The horde had set the village ablaze, and he dragged a child out of a burning house. Isla treated the wound with her mixture of clay and herbs. A week later, the wound was healing cleanly. Sovin walked through the gate and stopped. She looked at the walls, at the arches, at the vaulted ceiling of the community hall, at the aqueduct glistening in the winter sun. Her face remained impassive, but Dan saw her eyes. There was something in them that he recognized. Not anger, not fear, pain. That particular pain of a person who had believed in one thing for 30 years and now saw something else. She demanded a meeting with the elder. Garrick arrived. Sovin presented the seal of the Order of the Keepers of the Ashes, a silver disc bearing the imprint of a shattered column. She said that by the Order's authority, she would remain here to observe, that any use of the Eleanor legacy was sacrilege and subject to destruction by the Order's decree, that she would write reports, that if the reports were unfavorable, the Order would send a punitive squad. Garrick turned pale. Dan did not. He looked at Sovin and took stock. No heavy load, just a person. A gray cloak, too thin for winter. Her hands were red from the cold, traces of sweat on her forehead, even though it was freezing outside. She had walked a long way, alone, without supplies. The Order had sent her without provisions and without a guard. That meant one of 2 things. Either the Order didn't care about her, or the Order was testing not only him, but her as well. He set aside a room for her in the communal house, a small one, a warm one, with a south-facing window. Sovin walked in and stopped at the threshold. She touched the wall, whitewashed with lime, smooth, warm from the stove behind it. She stood there for a minute. Then she sat down on the bench and closed her eyes. Dan had left. For the first month, Sovin was a thorn in his side, a silent, stubborn thorn. She followed Dan around and took notes. What he was building, how he was building it, what he was building it from, which Illinoan elements he was using. She wrote on parchment in small, neat handwriting. Every evening, she would go to her room and write reports. She would fold the scrolls into a bag, but she didn't send them. There was no one to send them to. The nearest temple of the order was a 7-day journey away. In winter, the roads were impassable. She was alone with her reports and her faith. She quoted the dogmas every day, at breakfast, on the wall, near the workshops. Eleanor's pride had angered the creators. The long winter was their punishment. Recreating Eleanor's legacy would repeat the sin. The world must remain humble. The world must remain lowly. The world does not deserve greatness. Dan listened. He didn't argue. He built. Homes for refugees, an extension of the southern wall. A second granary for the growing population. 200 people now lived at the summit. Every day, a new task. Every day, new hands. Moran and his sons worked like machines. Brat commanded a construction crew of 12. Ren led the heavy work on the walls. Tauk hewed stone. Nell stamped bricks. Isla healed. Lissa kept track. The city grew. Sovin watched. And with each passing day, more and more crossed-out lines appeared in her notes. Dan hadn't been peeking. Lissa had told him. She was the one who'd been peeking. Lissa said that the priestess crossed out words and wrote new ones, and then crossed out those new ones too. Dan asked what words. Lissa said she couldn't read, but there were lots of symbols, and wet spots, like from water or from tears. The turning point came in the middle of winter, not because of Dan, because of Tom. The boy was 5. He ran around the fortress as if it were his own backyard. He knew every stone, every staircase, every crevice. He ran up to Sovin in the square and asked why she was always sad. Sovin looked down at him. She said she wasn't sad. Tom said she was sad, because she never smiled. Sovin said smiling wasn't necessary. Tom thought for a moment and asked if it was warm in her house. Sovin said it was warm. Tom said that his house used to be cold and he used to get sick, but now it's warm and he doesn't get sick, and that Dan made it that way, and that the stones are good. Then he ran off. Sovin stood in the square and watched him go. Dan saw her from the tower. He saw her standing there, how her shoulders slumped, how her hand holding the parchment fell by her side, how she turned and slowly walked toward the south wall. She stood at the edge. She looked down at the white world, and she stood there for an hour. After that, she stopped quoting the dogmas. She didn't announce it. She just stopped. She continued to follow Dan. She continued to take notes, but in silence, without comment, without judgment. A week later, she asked if she could help Ayla in the infirmary. Dan said anyone could help. Sovin went to see Ayla. Ayla looked at her suspiciously. Sovin rolled up the sleeves of her gray cloak and asked what to do. Ayla handed her some bandages. Sovin began rolling them up, silently, carefully, quickly. Her hands turned out to be dexterous. Ayla noticed and gave her a more difficult task. Dan came to see her that evening. He sat down across from her. He said he needed help. Not with bandages, with reading. He took out some scrolls, Aelinorian ones, with drawings in his own hand and text he couldn't read. Sovin took a scroll. She unrolled it. She looked at it. She froze. Dan saw her pupils dilate. She knew this language. The Order of the Keepers of the Ashes existed to remember and not repeat. But to remember, one must be able to read. She read aloud, slowly, translating in her mind. The text described a principle. The buildings of the Aelino Empire were constructed according to proportions that aligned with the nodes of natural energy. Every building with the correct proportions amplified the flow. The more buildings there were, the stronger the flow. The stronger the flow, the warmer the earth. The purer the water. The faster the plants grow. The empire didn't just build, it awakened the earth. But when there were too many buildings, when architects began building not for people, but for the flow, when buildings became resonators, amplifiers, and concentrators, the flow spiraled out of control. It struck. The long winter. The backlash. Sovin finished reading and fell silent. Her hands were trembling. The scroll lay on the table between them. She said that this confirmed the Order's dogma, that magic is dangerous, that to build is to awaken, that to awaken is to take a risk. Dan nodded. He said she was right, that awakening is dangerous. But he pointed to the walls around them, to the stove that had been burning longer than it should have, to the warm stone beneath their feet. He had already awakened it, not on purpose, without knowing, but he had awakened it. And now, the question wasn't whether to build or not to build. The question was how to build so as not to repeat the mistake. Sovin looked at him for a long time. Then she asked what the mistake had been. Dan explained. The Aelinori built for the flow. He builds for people. Every building is dedicated to a specific person. Myra's house so that Tom could breathe. The granary so that the grain wouldn't rot. The wall so that Lissa would live to be 18. Not an abstraction, not a system. People. Maybe that's the difference. Maybe magic that serves people behaves differently than magic that serves itself. Someone said that this wasn't proof. Dan agreed. He said it wasn't proof. A hypothesis. One they would test. Together. If she stayed. Not as a spy for the Order. As a keeper of knowledge. As a person who can read what he cannot. Sowen was silent. Then she nodded. Once. Briefly. Over the next few weeks, they worked together. Sovin translated the scrolls. Dan read the blueprints. Together, they pieced the picture back together. The Alino fortress on the Dragon's Back was a hub, the center of the network. The buildings at the summit were attuned to the flow, just as instruments are tuned to a note. The proportions of the walls, the height of the vaults, the depth of the foundations, everything mattered. And everything matched what Dan had been building intuitively. Sovin asked if this frightened him. Dan said it did, but not as much as the horde that would come in the spring. Spring was approaching. The walls were ready. The southern slope was fortified with a moat and a second wall. The tower stood. They had supplies. The people were trained. 200 men, 60 of them capable of wielding a weapon, against 3,000. The math didn't add up. Dan knew it. Garrick knew it. Brack knew it. Ren said nothing, but she didn't let go of her hammer. 3 weeks, that was all they had. Dan spent those 3 weeks in a feverish rush to rebuild. Hagen pointed out the weak spots. Dan sealed them off. The moat on the southern slope was deepened to 3 meters. The bottom was reinforced with sharpened stakes, their ends scorched to harden them. The arrow slits were reinforced. Now, on every 10-step section of the wall, there were 3 archers instead of 1. Volga hammered away without stopping. Arrowheads, brackets for the barricades, iron spikes for the moat. Dan built one more thing. Machicolations. These were projections at the top of the wall with openings in the floor through which boiling water could be poured, and stones dropped onto those standing at the base of the wall. The principle was simple. A stone ledge protruding 1.5 paces beyond the wall. The floor of the ledge isn't solid. There are 3 slits. Everything needed flies down through the slits. Hagen looked at the structure and smiled for the first time in 2 weeks. Clever, like a wolf. Ren built the mechanisms like a woman possessed. She grasped the idea instantly. The ledge had to be sturdy. If it collapsed under the weight of the boiling cauldron, it would collapse on its own. She made the corbels out of basalt, massive ones. Each block was embedded 2/3 of its length into the wall. 1/3 jutted out. It supports the shelf, it supports the cauldron, it supports the person who tips the cauldron over. Isla was preparing the infirmary for war. She didn't call it that. She called it an expansion. An expansion to 20 beds. An expansion of the bandage supply. An expansion of the collection of herbal decoctions. Hemostatic, analgesic, anti-inflammatory. She found a recipe for an antiseptic ointment. Pine resin mixed with honey and herbal extract. Not a sterile operating room, but better than nothing. Sovin helped Isla, silently, efficiently. She turned out to be a good organizer. She laid everything out in order. She labeled each pot of decoction. She compiled a list of the wounded the infirmary could accommodate. 40. Any more than 40 and they'd run out of bandages. Dan looked at her lists and thought that in another world, she would have been a logistics officer, or a military surgeon, or both. Lissa counted the people. 210 fortress residents. Of those, 100 were Haudrick spearmen. 60 were militiamen made up of residents and refugees. 50 were unable to fight, women with small children and the elderly. The wounded. 160 fighters against the horde. Lissa wrote the number on a birch bark strip and looked at Dan. She didn't ask if it would be enough. She could already count well enough to know the answer. The horde arrived at the end of the first month of spring. Not 200 scouts, the whole horde. Dan stood on the tower and watched. The eastern road was darkened by people, on horseback and on foot, carts and herds. The horde was not an army in the usual sense. It was a people on the march, warriors in the lead, families behind. They weren't coming to conquer and leave, they were coming to stay. Hagen climbed up to the tower. He counted. 1,200 warriors, maybe 1,500. The rest were civilians, women, children, the elderly, livestock. Fewer than the rumors suggested, but still 10 times more than the fortress's defenders. Hagen said that was bad, but not hopeless. If the walls hold, if there's enough water, if there's enough food, the siege can be held out. The horde is nomadic. It doesn't know how to lay siege. It knows how to strike and retreat. If the attack doesn't succeed on the first try, it might leave, or go around, or negotiate. The horde set up camp in the valley, where Clay Ford used to stand. The black, smoldering spots of the burned-down huts were hidden beneath hundreds of tents. Smoke from the campfires rose in columns. The noise carried all the way to the summit. Voices, the neighing of horses, the clang of metal. On the second day, a horseman rode up to the foot of the trail, alone, with a gray banner signifying negotiations. Dan went down to the gate. He didn't come out. He spoke through the wall. The horseman relayed the words of the horde's chieftain. The chieftain's name was Ashcan Greywolf. He was offering a deal. The fortress would surrender. The people would leave, alive, with whatever they could carry. The fortress would remain with the horde. Dan asked where they should go. The horseman shrugged. Wherever you want, just not here. Dan refused. The horseman rode off. At dawn on the third day, the horde launched an assault. They struck from the south, just as Dan had expected. The southern slope was gentle, the most accessible. 500 warriors scrambled upward, using ladders made of poles with shields held overhead. With a cry that bounced off the cliffs and multiplied into an echo, Dan stood on the tower with a spyglass he'd fashioned from polished quartz. He could see the entire field, like a drawing, like a map. The first wave, the moat. They didn't know about the moat. The front ranks fell through. Screams, spikes at the bottom. The second wave climbed over the bodies of the first, reached the wall. The ladders were set up. Hagen was in command on the south wall. His spearmen met the climbers with the tips of their spears. The militiamen poured boiling water through the machicolations. Ren stood by the machicolation, tipping one cauldron after another. Her face was stony. Her hands were red from the steam. She didn't shout. She worked. Just like on a construction site, stone by stone, cauldron by cauldron. From the tower, Dan saw a portion of the horde break off and head toward the eastern slope. He had been expecting this. He read the terrain like a map. The eastern path, narrow. 3 archers behind the wall. They opened fire when the first warrior appeared on the path. The path allowed only one person to pass at a time. Each subsequent warrior stepped over the body of the one ahead. An hour later, the trail was blocked. The survivors retreated. The south wall held. They were knocking down the staircases. One section of the wall cracked from the impact of a battering ram-type log. Brack gathered 5 men and propped up the wall from the inside with logs and stones in 10 minutes, while the assault continued from the outside. Dan saw this from the tower and made a mental note. The wall needs to be reinforced, in case of a second assault. If. By noon, the horde had retreated. Corpses lay on the southern slope and in the moat. Dan didn't count them. Hagen did. About 100. The defenders had 7 wounded, 1 killed, Haldrick's spearman, an arrow through the throat. Isla worked in the infirmary without looking up. Sovin helped her. Her gray cloak was covered in blood. She didn't notice. The horde hadn't left. They'd set up camp. They were waiting. Dan realized it. A siege. They'd wait until the food ran out, or the water, or their patience. He did the math. 2 months' worth of food on a strict ration. Water from the underground cistern and the aqueduct would last longer, if they didn't destroy the aqueduct. He looked at the western slope. The aqueduct ran through open terrain. 27 stone pillars. Each one could be toppled. No, it couldn't be done. They were made of basalt set in lime mortar. To destroy them would require tools the nomads didn't have. Probably. He hoped so. The siege lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks of silence, punctuated by brief, furious assaults. The horde tried 3 more times. From the south, with ladders longer than before. From the east, by sending suicide attackers onto the trail to clear the way with their bodies. From the west, by attempting to destroy an aqueduct pillar. The last attempt nearly succeeded. A group of 10 warriors with ropes crept up to the outermost pillar at night. They tied ropes around it. They began to pull. Dan heard the screech of stone and realized what was happening before he saw it. He sent Tauk with 5 men. A fight broke out at the pillar in the darkness. 2 of the 10 were killed. The rest survived. The pillar remained standing, with a crack, but it stood. Food was running out. Dan cut back on rations. Then he cut them back even further. The children received a full portion. The adults got half. The warriors got 3/4, because without them, the walls wouldn't hold. Isla made broth from anything she could boil down, bones, roots, and herbs. Lissa had lost weight. Her face had become sharp as a knife, but she kept track every day of how much food was left, how many days remained, and how many mouths to feed. The numbers kept getting worse. In the 5th week, Dan climbed the tower and looked out at the horde's camp. And he saw something he hadn't expected. The tents on the eastern edge had vanished. Wagons stood in a row, fully hitched. Part of the horde was leaving. He called Hagen. Hagen looked. He confirmed it. The nomads were moving out. Not all of them, but a significant portion. Civilians, families, livestock. They were heading south, bypassing the rock. Hagen said this meant only one thing. The chieftain had decided not to waste men. The rock stood. The walls stood. Casualties were mounting. Food in the Horde's camp isn't endless either. Nomads can't stay in one place. They need to move. They need new pastures, new villages to plunder. The rock isn't going anywhere. They might return, but for now, they're going around it. By the 6th week, the Horde had completely broken camp. The last tents disappeared at dawn. Dan stood on the tower and watched as the gray banner with the wolf faded into the distance along the southern road, toward the barony of Haldrick. 100 spearmen on the wall were looking in the same direction. Hagen was silent. Then he said he needed to go back, that the Baron needed to know, that the Horde had bypassed the rock and was heading toward him. Dan nodded. He said one thing, that the walls he had taught them to build could also be built in the barony, that Oren and Nell would go with the spearmen as promised, and that if the Baron wished, he could send people to learn, as many as needed. Knowledge does not diminish when you share it. Hagen looked at him for a long time. Then he held out his hand. Dan shook it. Hagen left with the spearmen and 2 apprentices. Oren looked back at the gate. Nell didn't look back. She kept walking forward, toward a new place, toward a new job. She carried with her what Dan had given her. Knowledge about clay, about mortar, about firing, and about the proportions that make a wall a wall. It was more valuable than any iron. The fortress remained. Battered, starving, with cracks in its walls, with the wounded in the infirmary, with people who hadn't slept properly or eaten their fill in 6 weeks, but still standing. Ren stepped out into the square after the Horde had left. She lifted her face to the sky. She closed her eyes. The sun was spring-like, warm. She stood there for a minute. Then she opened her eyes and went to repair the wall, without a word, without a pause. The war was over. There was work to be done. Dan set to work on the restoration. The south wall needed repair. The moat had collapsed in 2 places. The eastern path needed to be cleared. The aqueduct, with a crack in one of its pillars, needed to be reinforced. The tower had stood firm, undamaged. The community hall had stood firm. The underground cistern was full. The houses were intact. The city was alive. A city. For the first time, he thought of that word. Not a village, not a fortress. A city. 200 people behind stone walls atop a cliff. With a water supply, with workshops, with an infirmary, with a tower, with a library of Elenoir scrolls in the basement, with an architect who knows how to build and a priestess who knows how to read. It was a city. He needed a name. He stood on the tower in the evening and watched the sunset. The fortress walls caught the last light. The red brick glowed gold. The basalt blocks reflected the sun like black mirrors. The white mortar joints glowed between them. From below, in the valley, the city on the cliff looked like a torch. Light-colored walls against dark stone, set against a crimson sky. Lissa walked over and stood beside him. She asked what he was thinking about. He said he was thinking about a name. Lissa asked, "A name for whom?" Dan gestured around him. "For this," he said. Lissa thought for a moment. Then she said that from below, the city looked like a star, a white star on black rock. Dan looked at her. Then he said quietly, "Irostal." Lissa let the word roll off her tongue. She repeated it. "Irostal." She nodded. "That'll do." Spring turned to summer. Irostal grew. Refugees kept coming. 10, 20, 10 more. Every family was given a place to live. Every family was given a job. Every pair of hands found work, building walls, tending the furnace, or working in the workshop. By midsummer, 300 people lived in Irostal. By the end of summer, 400. Year 2. Eurostal became visible. Not just a village on a cliff, a town people were talking about. White walls against a black cliff. A tower visible from 2 days' journey away. An aqueduct glistening in the sun like a silver thread. Merchants came to look and stayed to trade. Artisans came to learn, and stayed to work. By the end of the second year, 600 people lived in Iristal. Dan built without stopping. A second tier of houses. The first two-story buildings in this world. Not a hut on top of a hut. A full-fledged second story, with vaulted ceilings, with staircases, with windows. Ren supervised the masonry. Moran set the corners. Brack, his hand now healed, led the crew. Tauk hewed the stone. Volg forged hinges, brackets, and window grills. Elni drew a map of Iristal, an accurate one, a beautiful one, with every building, with every street, with the aqueduct and the cistern, with the terraces on the southern slope, with symbols she'd come up with herself. Dan unfolded the map and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Elni. He said that it wasn't a map, it was a portrait. She smiled and said that portraits were her specialty. It's just that she usually draws the land rather than people. Dan replied that a city is, in fact, people. Elni looked at him in such a way that he fell silent. They began working together. Elni understood space in a way that no one in Dan's circle did. She saw the connections between buildings. She saw how the streets guided the eye, how a square opened up when you turned a corner, how a tower framed the view. She spoke 4 languages and knew the history of Vesper better than any textbook, which didn't exist here anyway. They could talk for hours about cities, about roads, about how space shapes society. 2 minds that had finally found each other. Dan and Sovin continued their work with the scrolls. The Elenoan blueprints unfolded one after another. Sovin translated the texts. Dan read the blueprints. Together, they reconstructed a map of the energy network for all of Western Vesperi. 23 nodes, connected by lines of energy flow. The Dragon's Back was one of the main ones, but not the only one. The other nodes lay far away, in the mountains, by the rivers, on the coast, all abandoned, all forgotten, all with the ruins of Elenoan structures. Kedrick walked across the square, and with every step he took, the air grew colder. Not by much, just a degree or two, but Dan could feel it. The stoves in the houses on either side of the square were flickering. The flames were dying down, as if someone were drawing the heat out of them, slowly, unhurriedly, like a person drinking water from a well, easily and naturally. Dan walked out to meet him, alone, unarmed, a rolled-up blueprint in his hand. Garrick stood by the gate of the community hall. Brack was on the wall. Ren stood by the workshop with his hammer. Sovin stood in the doorway of the infirmary. Ayla was inside. Lissa was on the tower. Everyone saw. Everyone was silent. Kedrick stopped 5 steps away from Dan. An old man, not frail, withered, like a tree that had stood for 300 years, having lost all its softness but remaining standing. A gray, wrinkle-free face, eyes light, almost white. A gray cloak reaching to the ground. His hands were hidden in his sleeves. He wasn't scary. He was inevitable, like winter, like a falling stone. He said he hadn't come to fight. He'd come to talk. Dan nodded. Cedric said he could feel it, a current, here, within these walls, within this stone. Faint, like the first trickle of water after a long drought. But it's there, and it's growing. Every building Dan erects adds a drop. Dan was silent. Cedric continued. He said he remembered. He remembered how the current had grown 300 years ago, slowly, beautiful, imperceptible. And then it struck. He was standing in Eleanor's capital that night. He saw the walls of the central resonator begin to glow, how the ground shook, how the entire city collapsed in seconds, how thousands of people perished beneath the stones they themselves had built, and how, after that, the world froze for 300 years. The stoves in the houses around the square went out one by one. Kedrick didn't raise his hand. He didn't utter any spells. He simply stood there, and the cold radiated from him like the scent of a bonfire. Naturally, unstoppably. Children in their homes woke up from the cold. One child began to cry, then another. The walls were covered with a thin layer of frost. In the cistern on the square, the water began to thicken. Kedrick said, "Stop this! I remember what happened. You don't understand what you're starting." Dan stood and listened. He stood and felt the cold. He stood and thought. 3 months ago, he didn't know how to respond. He had no answer. There were only walls and mortar and stubbornness. Now, he had an answer. He had read the scrolls. He understood what had happened, and he knew the difference. He spoke, quietly, calmly, just as he'd spoken to Garrick on the first day, just as he'd spoken to Myra by Tom's wheezing bedside, just as he always spoke, without grandstanding, without shouting, like a man who knows. He said he knew, that he had read the Alino scrolls, that Sovin had translated the texts, that he had seen the blueprints of the central resonator, a building without windows, without hearths, without a single room for living, a building built for power, only for power, and that it was a mistake. Not the currents, not the stone, not the magic. People. Architects who had forgotten why they were building. Kedrick listened. The cold didn't recede, but it didn't grow any stronger either. Dan unfolded the blueprint. He laid it on the stone in the square between them. The plan of Irostal. Every building, every street, every house, and next to every house, a name. Myra and Tom's house, Brack's house, Volga's workshop, Isla's infirmary, Isla's drying room, Sovin's library, Talk's smithy, Ren's house, Moran and his son's house. Every building was assigned to a specific person, designed for a specific need, built for a specific life. Dan said, "I know what went wrong back then. They were building structures for the flow. I'm building them for Myra, for Tom, for the girl who used to count to 12 and now counts to 1,000 and keeps track of an entire city. It's not the same kind of architecture, and it's not the same kind of magic." He pointed to the community hall. Its vault follows Illinoan proportions. Yes, but inside, there are benches where people sit and eat together. He pointed to the aqueduct. Its slope follows the Illinoan formula. Yes, but the water flows into homes where children drink and stay healthy. He pointed to the tower. Its height is a multiple of the Illinoan module. Yes, but from it, Lissa gazes at the horizon and counts the trade caravans. Every stone in this city knows for whom it was laid. Every wall remembers a name. And perhaps that is precisely why the flow here is different. Not wild, not greedy. Warm, like a stove that warms a house, not like a fire that burns it down. Kedrick was looking at the blueprint. Dan could see his eyes moving along the lines, over the names, over the little notes Dan had made for himself. The ceiling in Myra's house is a palm's width higher than standard, because Tom likes to jump up and down. The window in Volga's smithy faces north, so the light doesn't blind him while he works. The staircase in Sovin's library is wider than usual, because she carries heavy scrolls and needs room to move. Little things, details, human details in a stone city. Kedrick was silent for a long time. The cold hung heavy in the air. The children were crying. Hoarfrost crept up the walls. Sovin stepped out of the infirmary and stood 10 paces away, silently, a gray cloak against gray stone. She looked at Kedrick. He noticed her, recognized her, his priestess, his order, his eyes. And she wasn't standing with him. She stood between him and the infirmary, full of people whom she had bandaged with her own hands. Kedrick looked at Sovin. Sovin did not look away. Then Kedrick looked at the drawing, at the names, at the small human notes, and something in his face changed. Not his expression, something deeper, as if a stone had cracked. Not on the outside, on the inside. Somewhere in that part of his being that had kept the world cold for 300 years because it was convinced that was the right thing to do. He sat down, like an old man, heavily, right on the stone of the square, next to the drawing. His hands emerged from his sleeves, thin, gray, trembling. He placed his palm on the drawing, on Tom's name, and he wept, quietly, soundlessly. Tears streamed down his gray face and fell onto the stone. The cold receded, not immediately, slowly, like the ebb of the tide. The stoves in the houses flared up one after another. The fire returned. The warmth returned. The frost on the walls melted and dripped down. The water in the cistern splashed again. The children stopped crying. Behind Kedrick, the sun was rising in the east. The first rays crossed the ridge and struck the walls of Iristal. The red brick glowed gold, the basalt shone, the white mortar joints glowed like veins in the stone. The tower caught the light first, and for a moment became a beacon, visible for tens of kilometers around. Below, on the dragon's back, the first white walls of Iristal emerged from the shadows like the bones of the earth. Mara stepped out of her house. Tom was holding her hand. He had seen the old man in the square. He broke free, ran over, sat down beside him, looked into the gray face wet with tears, and said, "Don't cry. It's warm here." Cedric looked at the boy who, 2 years ago, had been gasping for breath in a dark hut in the swamp, who was supposed to have died from the damp, the smoke, and the poisoned water, who was alive because one man had dug a hole by the wall and cut a slit in the roof. The old man raised his head. He looked at Dan. He said he was tired, that 300 years was too long, that he had kept the world cold because he was afraid that people would build for power again, that they would forget why again, that it would strike again. Dan sat down beside him. He said that fear was understandable, that the memory of the catastrophe wasn't a curse. It was knowledge, and that knowledge shouldn't be hidden. It needed to be preserved, to remember what had happened, and to ensure it wouldn't happen again. He suggested that Cedric stay, not as the keeper of the ashes of a dead empire, but as the keeper of the memory of a living city, as a man who remembers the mistake and can warn others if he sees it happening again. Cedric was silent. Then he looked at Sovin. She nodded. Once. Kedrick stayed. A year had passed, the third since Dan woke up face down in the mud. Iristal stood on the dragon's back. White walls against black rock. 600 people, 27 stone houses, a watchtower, an aqueduct, terraces, workshops, an infirmary, a library. The first school in Vesper in 300 years. Sovin taught there, the Eleanor language, history, mathematics, which she had learned from Dan. Lissa was her best student. Baron Haldrick sent an embassy with a proposal to form an alliance of the borderlands. Iristal, the barony, Solheim, the 3 points of a triangle, trade routes, joint defense, common building standards. Dan agreed. He wasn't the one to lead the alliance. Garrick, the village head of Clayford, the man who, for 20 years, had kept the village in the swamp out of sheer stubbornness. Brack returned from Solheim. He had built a port there, a stone pier with a breakwater. The Merchants Guild paid with grain and iron. Brack brought a wagon train, and he brought 3 apprentices from Solheim who wanted to continue their studies. Ren finished building the second tower, the southern one, 2 meters taller than the first. It stood on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the road along which the horde had departed. The horde never returned. It went further west. It encountered the walls of Haldrick. It turned south. It scattered. It broke up into small groups. The era of raids ended, not by the sword, but by stone. Isla opened a second drying room, complete with a ventilation shaft she designed herself, an aqueduct for air, just as she had dreamed. It worked perfectly. Her ointments and decoctions were distributed throughout the Union. Merchants bought them up for silver. Isla didn't take silver. She took seeds, new plants. Her terraced garden became the largest in Aerostal. She brought Dan tea every morning. The blend was still changing. She still knew what he needed before he did. Elni had finished the large map. All of Western Vesperi, with trade routes, with borders, with the ruins of Eleanor structures marked, with 23 key points. She hung the map in the community hall, next to the blueprint of Iristal. 2 documents on the wall, the city and the world. The scale of what had already been accomplished and the scale of what lay ahead. Kedrick sat in the library and dictated to Sovin, the history of Eleanor. The real one. Not legends, not myths, facts. What they built, how, why, and what went wrong. Sovin wrote it down, every word, in small, even handwriting on birch bark, then on parchment. Then it would be carved into stone, so that it would be remembered, so that it would not be repeated. Evening. Dan was walking through Iristal, slowly, checking, as always, every wall, every seam, every chimney. Yellow light streamed from the windows, real windows, with glass made from a bull's bladder. Every house was warm. A fire burned in every one. The streets were clean. Snow fell softly onto the stone. Dan stopped in the middle of the square and lifted his face toward the snowfall. Snowflakes fell on his cheeks and melted. Myra stepped out the door. She saw him. She walked over. Silently, she draped a woolen cloak over his shoulders. That very one. Warm, smelling of home. Dan turned toward her. She stood beside him. She didn't speak. She just stood there. Tom peeked out the door and called out that the soup was ready. Myra smiled. So did Dan. Isla leaned out of the window across the way. She called out, "Architect, come have some tea. You'll freeze, you fool." Dan laughed. Sovin looked up from the scroll in the library window. She looked out at the square, at Dan in his woolen coat, at Myra beside him, at the snow, and she smiled. For the first time in 30 years, a genuine smile that only stone had ever seen. Ren came out of the workshop, a hammer slung over her shoulder. She saw the group in the square. She walked over. She stood beside them. She didn't say a word. She nudged Dan with her shoulder so that he swayed. He nudged her back. She laughed, loudly. In the silence of the snowfall, Lissa sat on the steps of the tower, a birch bark scroll on her lap. She was writing. Not numbers, not curses. Names. Everyone who had ever lived in Iristal. 600 names. She knew every single one. Because she wasn't counting bricks. She was counting people. Elne stood on the south tower and looked down. At the city in the snow. At the lights in the windows. At the tiny figures in the square. She took out charcoal and birch bark and began to draw. Not a map. For the first time, not a map. A portrait. The city from above. White walls, black rock, yellow lights, snow. Down below in the square, Dan stood among the people who had become his family. In the city he had built for each of them by name. On the stone that had remembered his hand 300 years before his birth. He didn't know why. He didn't know who those 146 before him had been. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew one thing. This city stands, and it will stand, because every stone in it was laid for a specific person. And as long as people remember this, the stones will not fall. He breathed in the cold air. He exhaled. He looked at the lighthouse tower, catching the last light of the fading day, at the walls that Ren had built, at the aqueduct through which the water found by Isla flowed, at the library where Sovin kept the memories, at the map that Elne had drawn, at the school where Lissa had counted to 1,000, at the house where Tom slept without wheezing. It all starts with one house, with one hole by the wall, with one crack in the roof, with one boy who stopped wheezing. We'll figure out the rest later. Dan turned around and headed home, to hot soup, to warm walls, to people he knew by name. Snow was falling on Iristal. The city glowed. The first city in 300 years. A city built not for the gods, for people.